Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Welcome to this episode of The Murder Part. Tonight we'll be looking at the case of Jeff Pelley. So I want to introduce my co-host, Jeff and Mike. How you doing, guys?
Doing pretty well.
I'll start with you, Jeff. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Jeff Pincin. I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of Delaware and Pennsylvania. I specialize in OCD using exposure and response prevention therapy, as well as body-focused repetitive behaviors, treating them. And I've been a therapist for a couple of years now, I guess. And happy to be here tonight.
So if you couldn't have been a counselor, what occupation would you have selected?
Now, what I really, really wanted was to be a model for mullets. That's really what I wanted. I mean, you figure that they were all the rage, probably not, but they were all the rage. And it could have been me, right? I could have been the one in all those images with the mullet. And it would have been perfect.
Living the dream.
Living the dream, right. But instead...
Business in the front, party in the back.
That's what I'm saying, right? That's what I'm saying. It would have been perfect, right? But instead, all my dreams were just banished because the 90s come along and they just... Nobody likes them anymore. 2000s, even more so. I had to settle to be a counselor.
Yeah, so sorry to hear that.
Yeah,
that's rough.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rough.
Thank you.
Such a disappointment career-wise. All right, Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well.
Tell us about yourself.
My name's Mike Smith. I'm also a licensed professional mental health counselor in the state of Delaware. My focus is in narrative therapy, geek therapy, and geek culture in general. I enjoy all things movie, video games, fantasy, sci-fi genre things.
And what would you want to do if you weren't in that line of work in counseling?
Let's see. There's a lot of options over the years. I think land developer would have been one of the most interesting ones out there. Kind of like that's the $1 million business right there. That's where the money is. Like you get the land, and then you get everything else. That comes with it.
Not making more land, right?
They're not making more than that. As Lex Luthor in Superman said back in 1977, Christopher Reeves, he said, land.
That's right.
That's where the money is.
That's a great movie.
Yeah.
Mike, what a life that would have been.
It would have been.
I mean, instead of being a counselor, you could have been a land developer.
I could have been a land developer, but unfortunately, I never found the money to be able to start that particular business, and I ended up having to become a mental health counselor.
Probably just $20 or $30 million short, right?
Yeah,
we're not talking a huge...
It was pocket change away, but it never manifested.
Just change some daily spending habits, and you could be right there.
I could have.
Should have gotten investors, maybe from Florida.
Maybe. Could have. Florida's a great place for that.
Dr. Grande, what job would you have had if not a counselor?
That's a good question. I think maybe a car mechanic. I think car mechanic would have been the way to go. You know, by yourself, working in peace, taking things apart, putting them back together sometimes. You know, if you're a good mechanic. You know. Yeah, I think
always having leftover parts.
Yeah, you're kind of scratching your head like, does this bolt go to something? I've been there many times, actually.
you do. It's done right if you have leftover parts. If you've got nothing left over, you did something wrong.
That's right.
You're not a good enough mechanic. Specifically, you would like to work on 1984 Mustangs, though, right?
84 Mustang is the dream. Yeah, I think it was a 5-liter, right? 5-liter back then.
The dream car to
That's
work
right.
on.
A modern marvel, right?
You'll always have extra parts with that.
Oh, yeah, always. The distributor caps just laying all over the place.
Sometimes they just come off as you're driving. You don't even need tools for that particular car. All right, so we are looking at this Jeff Pelley case, and this case is kind of a sleeper, right? You first look at it, you're like, oh, this guy committed murder. We've covered a lot of that, right? It's the murder part, after all. And you start to think, I think when you start looking at a lot of these cases, by default you think, okay, I mean, the police are wrong sometimes, prosecutors are wrong sometimes, but most of the time, when somebody's charged, they probably did it, whether they're found guilty or not. This guy happened to be found guilty for a crime, you think, okay, probably did it.
Sure.
But then as you start looking at this case, a lot of doubt gets introduced. Not just a little, not just like one witness who holds out, but a lot. And it starts to make you wonder if this wasn't a huge miscarriage of justice. So what are your initial thoughts about the Jeff Pelley case?
You're very right. that at first, of course, it's the kid killed his family. That's crazy. This is horrible. But there's so many details that the average person wouldn't be able to figure out, right? So many specific things all over the country, really, that really add a lot to this case and make you think, I think there was a lot that was missed. At the very least, didn't get a fair trial. And it struck me that, it seemed anyway, that they were really just more or less going off of his attitude, his personality, right? He was a 17-year-old, and 17-year-olds, teenagers, they're kind of characterized by not being very smart sometimes, right? Not being very knowledgeable or aware of how they're presenting themselves, right? And so they might be kind of acting bad or giving off kind of a bad vibe to other people. It just seems to be the case with Jeff Pelley, which, I mean, I was like that as a teenager, made some dumb mistakes, right? I'm sure many people have. And that seemed to really be what was on trial here, was he's got this bad personality, he's got bad behavior, some criminal activity. So it must have mean that he did it. We don't have any evidence, but that must mean what it is. And just based on the way he was acting, which we've seen many times before, that seems to be a major contributor to their conclusion.
Yeah, well, the best way not to be convicted is not to be tried. And I think that sometimes people are tried based on that really flimsy kind of like, oh, the emotions aren't right. They're not acting the right way. In this case, he's rebellious, and he did have a bit of a criminal past and some rambunctious behavior. So then it's just a domino effect, right? So then he's tried, and then, of course, if you're tried, you have a chance of being convicted, and that's what we saw. What are your thoughts, Mike?
So we've covered other cases where it's pretty obvious who did it. Betty Broderick, Jodi Arias, like, we know they did it. It's 100% we know they did it. And we've covered some other ones where we're not sure who did it. Like Darlie Lynn, like kind of 50-50. Like, I don't know. Like I said in that video, I don't know. I'm not sure. 50-50. In this particular case, I'm 100%. I am 100%. Jeff Pelley did not do this.
100%. That's a bold statement.
It is a bold statement, but just looking at the evidence that was actually collected, which is virtually none. The circumstances are basically the only thing that convicted him. The motive that they came up with convicted him, and I personally find that to be absolutely ridiculous. And to me, it's the timeline. Right. The prosecutor's timeline does not hold water for me. And just...
This is a really challenging case as far as the window that the prosecution painted themselves into with the timeline. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I've ever seen a case where they've constricted it so much. Right. This was their investigation. This wasn't other people like, oh, the time's restricted. They're the ones saying, no, it was this 20-minute, approximately 20-minute window. Right. And they're going in front of a jury and saying, look, it happened in these 20 minutes. Like, again, they're introducing the idea. Mm-hmm. Right. And they're saying, basically, this kid is like the Flash.
He's the Flash. He had to have, I have a list of all the things that he would have had to have done that I could think of. All the things he would have had to have done in that 20-minute window in order to have pulled this off, as prosecutors said. Amongst them is like taking a shower, cleaning the bathtub, doing laundry. Like, all of this stuff has to be done in 20 minutes. I don't buy it.
Things that 17-year-olds are not really good at either.
Right. 17-year-olds, I don't know very many 17-year-olds that are really good at doing laundry.
Right. Efficiently.
But apparently, he did really efficient laundry. Like, so good that he got his pants clean and then wore them again and then put them back in to without blood on them.
Yeah.
Like,
super efficient.
Super efficient, super fast. And just like, even the lowest end of time, like the lowest end of the time that I could calculate, that I could estimate, he might have had enough time to do it if he then drove like 70 miles an hour on back roads to get from point A to point B.
Or 88 miles.
Or 88 miles per hour. Mm-hmm. Like,
it could go back in time.
But it was a 1984 Mustang, not a DeLorean. Right. That is a problem. I don't think there was a flux capacitor to be seen anywhere around there, but it's just 100% sure based on timeline stuff, based on the lack of evidence.
I also think with the prosecution, to speak to your point, Mike, they have, again, this kid run around like the Flash, but they're also saying he's basically low in conscientiousness. He's an impulsive criminal who committed a number of crimes in the community. So that's usually connected with being disorganized and not following a plan, even if you made the plan.
And then they also somehow include him being a criminal genius.
Right.
Because he managed to figure out how to clean this entire crime scene and dispose of all the evidence, every bit of evidence.
Flawlessly.
That's never been found.
Yeah. I think
Got rid of the murder weapon, got rid of the shell casings, got rid of everything perfectly. Never got found, but they know he did it.
Yeah, it was the only crime he ever would have gotten away with, right? Like he got caught for pretty much everything else he did, but in the most complex crime with the most investigators, and I'm sure millions of dollars spent on the investigation, or a lot of money, he almost beat the system. For years he went not arrested. Right? He moved on to his life. So let's take a look at the story here. This is actually a pretty complex narrative for a fairly direct crime, for homicides that occur at one time. Robert Lee Pelley first met his wife, Joy Armstrong, in the 60s when they studied at Mount Vernon Nazarene University in Ohio. This becomes relevant later on, the Nazarene piece, although was it a Nazarene church he eventually went to? It was another type of church.
Yeah, I don't think it was a Nazarene church.
I think it was United. It was a United church.
Okay. So he starts off Nazarene and he changes.
Olive Branch United Brethren Church.
Brethren. That's right. That's what it is, Brethren. Yeah. Yep.
But it's still, still an interest in Christianity. I think Nazarene is a fairly conservative religious belief system. I'm not sure about the United Brethren.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah. So usually in like rural areas, I would tend to think conservative would probably win out most of the time. So I don't think it'd be a stretch to say, probably not big fans of things like, well, I know Nazarenes, like drinking, dancing, things like that. So the couple was married by 1970. They'd have a son, Jeff Pelly, who is the protagonist in this story. He was born in 71. In 76, they would have a daughter, Jackie, and she would later say the family was close. She described them as normal family. Mm-hmm. The family moved to Florida in the late 70s, first to Orlando, then to Cape Coral, and they were there around 79 or 80. Robert was a computer programmer when this would not have been a popular job.
No, it wouldn't have been. That was early 80s was not a time for popular computer programming stuff, but Bob started working in computers in the 70s. Like right after he and Joy got married, he took a job at a place called Square D Manufacturing as one of their computer programmers working in the computer side of things. And so by the 80s, when they moved to Cape Coral, he moved into working at Landmark Bank as a computer supervisor at one of their data centers.
Mm-hmm. I imagine back then that the computer programmer or anybody working with computers would have been, you've had to do a lot more than you would have to do today. Not as much user-friendly kind of things, a lot more hardware to work with, and a lot more things that could potentially go wrong, as opposed to these nice little, machines that we have today. So I imagine that, maybe it wouldn't have been as popular, but it probably would have been much more involved and therefore much more to do, much more knowledge perhaps involved in that. Mm-hmm. So I can only imagine what it would have been like for Bob or anybody during that time.
Yeah, I think my smartwatch has more computing power than that data center had in the 1980s. I know like these phones that we have, the cell phones we have today have way more computing power than the entirety of NASA in 1969 had. Like a graphing calculator has more calculating power than NASA in 69, but we had a lot of, it was big machines, big computers. Bob Pelly was really into that, apparently, working in that direction. Like he had studied religious studies at university and then went into computers. Like it's a heck of a career change, but it made money. Mm-hmm. Like by 83, they owned their own home in Cape Coral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he was a pioneer in a field which is now like everybody and their brother works in it. But yeah, back then you had to be a bit of a MacGyver, to your point, Jeff. Like you had to really know a lot. Yeah. Even though there wasn't a lot to know comparatively, there were no specialists. You pretty much, you're a computer guy. You had to know.
You were the specialist.
Yeah.
Everybody's the specialist in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, much different time. Now, eventually he worked for a bank. Right, he moved to a bank and a data processing center. And then we see that in 1984, Joy Pelly was diagnosed with skin cancer. Now, she would die on February 24, 1985, when she was 34. But this is an interesting piece of the puzzle, too. She didn't receive treatment for the cancer.
She did initially. She received treatment and it went into remission for several months. And then it came back. When it came back the second time, that's when she said, nope, I don't want any treatment.
Yeah.
Basically, kind of at that point, she told her daughter, Jackie, recalled in several interviews that she said it was God's will at that point. And she wasn't going to fight it.
Mm-hmm.
She kind of accepted the fate more or less, and just this is what's happening, and that's what it's going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's known if she would have survived with treatment after, in that second round when she kind of went with faith.
I don't know. In the 1980s, treatment for cancer wasn't as advanced as it is today.
Mm-mm.
If it was today, it might have been a case of, we just treat this and it'll be fine. But in 84...
Yeah, we're also not aware of the stage, which I think would tell us a lot,
yeah.
Especially like skin cancer. So we see here that Robert seems a little cold at this point. He wouldn't let Jeff or Jackie cry over their mother's death.
Right.
Well, he raised them with that idea of you don't cry. He said that was how he was raised, that you're not allowed to cry for any reason. And so when Joy died in February of 85, he told him, don't cry.
Mm-hmm. I don't know about you guys, but I imagine you do, but I've heard this a lot from clients before, just this idea that I can't cry or I don't want to cry for multiple reasons. I don't want to look a certain way. I don't want to be perceived a certain way. I want to just be able to get over it and not express emotions, whatever it is. We see it a lot with guys, mostly with guys, I think, but I see it with women as well. Just this idea that crying somehow makes you weak or somehow inferior to other people. And it's sad, of course, to think that somebody would say, no, you can't cry. That's not allowed. Somehow that's you're lesser than for whatever reason if you cry. And it's a shame that is a mindset for a lot of people, oftentimes without realizing it. But it's a shame that was the case here too.
I will admit that was my mindset for a long time.
Sure.
That going through the counseling program, learning how to become a counselor, becoming much more in touch with who I am and what my emotional states are. I fully admit I'm a big old crier. Like I cry at TV shows, I cry at movies. Like I'll cry at the drop of a hat at this point because it's a release, it's a catharsis. Yeah. Very often. But to speak to your point, it was sad to think back and say, wow, he prohibited them from really delving into their grief and trying to deal with the emotions that came up. For kids to be told to be prevented from feeling those feelings.
I have a friend here in Delaware who has a podcast called Men That Cry or Men Who Cry, something like that. And it's an interesting premise, of course, encouraging that when so many men are so much against that and have this idea that they can't. It's not right for them to do that, or again, somehow they're inferior. And I think that's really great, much to your point, Mike, that we're crossing that divide in some ways to understand that's okay. And really that's welcomed in many circumstances too. Let it out, do the cathartic thing, and express yourself, right? Express the emotion.
Yeah, I think if you look at the culture of the time, now this was what, in 80, 84, 85, Robert's now painted kind of a monster, right? Like, oh, I can't believe that. And, I think I kind of agree in a way, like that seems very counterproductive under the circumstances. But in 1985, it was pretty normal. I don't think he was deviating much from the culture.
Yeah. I don't think he was. I think that's how he was raised. That's how he was raising his kids, and that was what was expected. And in 1985, that wasn't outside the norm.
Yeah, he was mainstream, I think, for that year. Now, good.
As I say, so Joy died February 24th of 1985. Coincidentally, January 2nd, there was another death that actually really impacts this story. And that was Edward Huber.
That's right. It's a parallel, right? It's two situations in two separate places in Ohio. Edward Huber dies. Now, there's a little bit of a mystery with his death.
There is.
So, maybe he brought an end to his life. It could have been an accident, but it's probably one or the other. So he left a 28-year-old widow named Dawn Huber. Now, she had 3 daughters, their names also began with J, just like we see with Jeff and Jackie. She had Jessica, Janelle, and Jolene.
Now, Jeff's actual name is actually Robert Jeffrey Pelley,
Right.
but he went by Jeff, so they didn't have confusion between him and his dad. But yeah, I think that was when they finally met and talked about things. I think that was probably one of those funny moments for them. Like, wait, all your kids are named with J's too? Oh, my kids are named with J's. Kind of a fun little thing.
Kind of because we're meant to be.
Yeah, because they would meet a few months after Joy died.
Right. They would meet in Ohio when Robert's two children were visiting relatives there, and he, I don't know if he drove or flew, but he went out there one way or the other to pick them up. And he hit it off with Dawn.
Yeah.
Right.
He was introduced to Dawn by his niece, who was actually Dawn's best friend. And so, like, she knew, this woman, Katie, knew that Dawn's husband had just died, and she knew that Bob's wife had just died. So she's like, well, you guys got something in common already. Mm-hmm. And apparently that was kismet. It was meant to be.
Yeah, so they hit it off, and they would marry in November of 1985, which is quick.
8 months after Bob's wife passed away.
Only 9 months after Dawn's husband had passed away. April or May was around the time when they met, and then they married in November. That's quick.
Yeah, foot to the floor in this case. So the family would live in Florida, but then they moved to Lakeville, Indiana. Now, this is the first time in this story I'm aware of Indiana being in the picture. They moved there in 86.
Yeah, they moved 1 year after their anniversary, or they're on their first anniversary was when they moved to Lakeville.
Yeah, so big change, right? From Florida, from the culture of Florida to a town. I don't know how many people it had. It was pretty small, a few hundred. I think it was 400 or 500 at the time.
I think you're right.
Something like that,
small.
right? So
they describe it as small enough for everyone to pretty much know each other. And if there was somebody that wasn't from the town, generally speaking, they would know about it, or they would kind of know, like, this person doesn't look familiar. I know pretty much everyone here. This person doesn't really fit in, with this. So small enough to know that.
Yeah, which I think comes important later on.
Right.
So Robert, again, was a computer programmer, successful, made a lot of money. And then he took this job as a minister in Lakeville, Indiana. And the Olive Branch United Brethren Church, which you mentioned, is a 100-member church, which was probably everybody in that town who went to church. I don't know how many churches a small town would have.
Yeah, right.
It depends on the area, but some of them have quite a few.
Yeah, it could be. Well, because churches could be small too, right? Yeah. But in terms of a major, people come together on Sunday. A lot of people. This was probably the main game in town, I would guess, or at least one of the very few.
One of the main games.
Yeah.
But, if your town has 400 people and 100 of them are going to one church, that's a pretty major church. It's a quarter of the population of the town going to this one church. So I mean, that's pretty big. Bob, he had the religious studies background. He moved. They moved to Lakeville to live in the parsonage. Like they lived in the house that belonged to the church.
Right, which is pretty common in many religious systems. So it was right next door. Right, so you're on this road, and there's the house, a white ranch, and the church is right next to it. And apparently, people would stop by and just walk in the house.
Well, if you look at the church still stands today, so does the parsonage. If you look at the Google image, like they share the parking lot.
Right.
It's like the driveway is the parking lot for the church.
Yeah, so it was really kind of, it all functioned, they're both church buildings, so it wasn't like this was a house where no one knew who lived there. They purposely knew he lived there, and they would go in, and apparently these people stopped by pretty much every day and just walked right in. So Robert, again, making much less money. It seemed like an odd move.
Right.
Especially now with a huge family, five kids to support. He takes a huge pay cut and moves to an area, again, very inconsistent with the culture of Florida. Mm-hmm. Like if he liked Florida, wouldn't necessarily like rural Indiana.
Right. There may be reasons for that, and we could touch on them, some of them later. But and sometimes if you get a chance to follow your dream, you do. If Jeff had the chance to become a mullet model right now, even if it's a pay cut.
I'm taking off my headphones
That's
and
right.
I'm leaving.
Yes.
See you guys later.
Just saying.
If they're coming back, I'm there.
You gotta get that dream when you can. You gotta grab it when it's in front of you.
Literally by the hair. Grab it by the hair. Much to your point, Mike, you could perhaps make the argument, knowing no other details about this, that, maybe he always wanted to be a pastor. Maybe he just found the opportunity and, he had to go right then. Yeah. But then you also hear other details that he wasn't actually a minister, right? He hadn't gone to school or didn't have the proper credentials for this.
He wasn't ordained.
He wasn't ordained, right? And he wasn't even trying at that point to become ordained. So you hear more details and you're like, wait a minute. And then, of course, we're going to talk about all the details. So it's like, okay, I see where this is going.
Aren't there a number of movies, I can't think of any at the top of my head, but aren't there a number of movies where there's like a preacher in a small town? And I think it was one like Clint Eastwood that was famous. I can't remember the title of the movie, but I think he beat somebody up with an axe handle in the movie. But that's not unusual for Clint Eastwood westerns.
Movie. That's not unusual.
But yeah, the preacher or the preacher man, like that's kind of like a mystical movie figure, especially like westerns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that would have spoken to people just coming into their house and into the church as well as kind of the maybe perhaps the center of the community, and people would go there for support, would go there for just have a listening ear, maybe something like that. So in a small town like that, that might have been really what it was centered around, and maybe they would have expected behavior like that, people to just be showing up randomly and without much notice.
And that kind of an interaction between Bob and the family and the community in general actually went into a lot of the stuff with the investigation of what happened later.
Yeah, so let's get to that. Let's get to the spring of 1909.
Yeah.
So we moved to Sunday, April 30. Members of the church started to show up for the 9:30 a.m. service, as was customary. They noticed Robert wasn't there, and as the pastor, preacher, whatever he was considered, normally he would be there.
Yeah, early too.
He was known to be there like on time, like 9 o'clock. The service starts at 9:30. He's usually in the church at 9 o'clock, if not before. And I'm not sure whether it was a deacon or
I heard a trustee.
Trustee.
Talking about Dave Hathaway.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was one of those like military guys, like on the dot, like all the time. And that particular day, he was actually late. Mm-hmm. So when he showed up at 9:15, he expected Bob to kind of give him a little bit of a
hard time
or something for that, a little bit of crap for it. But Bob wasn't there, and he keeps going, and 9:30 comes and Bob's still not there. 9:45 comes and people are starting to get a little nervous. They're going over to the parsonage and knocking on the door. No answer.
Mm-mm. No, so Hathaway actually gets a key from another church member and enters the house.
And what's interesting is that key wasn't even there. That person had to go back to their house and come back with the key. And then they opened the door. They were able to kind of manipulate it because it wasn't actually a key to the parsonage. It was just a close enough key. They were able to kind of use it as a bump key and kind of jiggle it and finally get it through.
Oh, is that why it wasn't working? I thought they were saying that they were using
it wasn't
a
actually
key for the parsonage,
it wasn't
but for
actually,
whatever reason it didn't work.
Yeah, it wasn't actually a key to the parsonage. It was a similar type key. It was a similar type of lock.
Okay.
And they kind of had to put it in there and jiggle it enough to move it. It's what they call a bump key.
Sure.
If you shave it down and just have the grooves right, you might be able to get things into place to be able to turn. And that's kind of what they did. They finally got the door unlocked and then entered.
Yeah, and the first thing he noticed, he saw Robert's glasses on the floor. Then he saw Robert Pelly laying on his back in a pool of blood, and he strongly suspected he was not alive.
It would be a good suspicion. A pool of blood, not moving. I might suspect someone's dead too. Yeah,
it didn't look too good for Robert. First responders arrived. They agreed. They concurred. He was, in fact, dead. He had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the neck and chin. So I guess it was a slug went through his neck and chin.
Good call by Hathaway.
He called it right.
Yep. Pretty good eye for that.
It pays to be accurate. Right?
Well, and so he had the military background too, and so I don't know his military background, but I would assume that he has some kind of experience with combat. Maybe they said he was a Vietnam vet, didn't they? So he had perhaps had seen dead bodies before, dead people before. So kind of perhaps he knew how to react in that situation better than somebody else who never had any experience with that. So maybe he was a little bit less. I don't know, less struck by that, less panicked by that maybe, and was able to therefore react a little bit better.
Yeah, I think he actually tried to keep another church member out initially, so she wouldn't see what he was seeing. So now that, first responders come in, of course, again, they find Robert dead, but they also find some other people dead in the basement of the same house. Dawn, Janelle, and Jolene. They had also been shot to death.
Absent from the house were Jeff, Jackie, and Jessica, which was both of Bob's kids and Dawn's oldest.
Right. Yeah. So three uninvolved in this, in terms of being victims. So we see that whoever perpetrated this crime fired 6 shots, and the police believed, almost certainly, it was a 20 gauge shotgun, slugs specifically.
Deer slugs. Now they know it was at least 6 shots because there were 2 in Bob, 1 for each of the victims downstairs because they were shot downstairs. For Janelle, Jolene, and Dawn, they were all shot in the head, single shot each. And then there was what they called the skip shot, which was in the wall in the stairwell leading down to the basement, which appeared to be a shot that, kind of a follow shot that missed. So they surmised that whoever did the shooting was chasing them downstairs, fired and missed, and then came around and got them.
Yeah, when they stopped moving. Yeah. So we see, these dead bodies here, but nothing in the house other than that was disturbed. The doors were locked. There was no forced entry, and nothing had been stolen.
All the curtains were drawn too.
Right, which they said was abnormal, being a house that people would frequently come into. I didn't understand. One of the details was that whoever did this picked up the shells from the shotgun shots, but they left the wadding. Now, I'm not familiar with the composition of ammunition for shotguns or anything, but I understand that the wadding is there to, I think, separate pieces, but they left the wadding there from these shotgun shells. And so they picked up the shells, but not the wadding. And I couldn't figure out why that was, if there was a better reason than just they forgot or something.
So a shotgun and a standard bullet are slightly different. The casing of a bullet is usually brass. And you have a primer, which just makes a spark. When the firing pin hits the primer, it makes a spark. And then there's gunpowder in between that and the bullet,
right.
The actual lead tip that gets expelled. And the spark ignites the powder explodes and sends the bullet out the barrel.
Right.
Because the barrel has grooves in it, it spins and it goes straight. Pretty straight. Shotgun has what's called a smooth bore, which means there's no rifling in the barrel, and tends to use different types of shot. Bird shot is really tiny little BBs, a whole bunch of them. In order to pack the powder behind that, they use what's called wadding,
right.
Which is nowadays is usually a plastic cup that has some fingers and holds all of the stuff in place. And you have the primer and then the powder, and you put it inside. Usually it's a plastic casing instead of brass, although there are some brass cases out there. Regular shot, buckshot, as opposed to slugs, is slightly larger. And the buckshot is usually where we get the gauge term from. And it's like a 12 gauge, 16 gauge, 20 gauge, or a 410 gauge. It's based on the size of those buckshot pellets. Yeah. And so bird shot is much, much smaller because it's aimed at shooting at small birds. Right. Like quails, partridges, things that if you shot them with much bigger pellets would just disintegrate. So you use smaller pellets so that they don't get destroyed. But the buckshot tends to be the slightly bigger, and that's what you use on other animals. Slugs tend to be like 3 to 5 bigger bullets size things. They have their own grooves on it so that they'll spin in the barrel. And again, in all of these cases, because you have multiple projectiles together, you have the wadding. So it keeps all of those together so that they can be discharged all at the same time. The wadding, in this particular case, there was plastic wadding, which most of the time plastic wadding is as easy to pick up as a shell. And other was cardboard. Some manufacturers used cardboard, and the cardboard will shred. It'll burn just like anything else would when exposed to flame, which is what the gunpowder does. So the cardboard would shred. That'd be harder to pick up. But to that point, like, I'm not sure why the wadding was left behind either.
Yeah.
And it seems in this particular case that the plastic wadding shredded too.
Yeah, my guess is it was left behind because it's projected out of the barrel. So sometimes it ends up in the target.
Okay.
Right? Sometimes it ends up past the target and caught in the air and go quite a distance.
A little bit more unpredictable. You might not be able to realize where all of it's at, perhaps.
Yeah, whereas the shell would have ejected typically out of the right side of the weapon. And I don't know if this was a pump action.
It was a pump action.
Okay.
It was a Mossberg pump action, say 500.
Was it a 500?
Yeah.
So
Mossberg 500 pump action.
So it's a twin alarm pump. So when you pulled that back, open the action, it's going to fall out, usually within a few feet of where you're standing. But the wadding goes in the direction of in this case, the slug. So as a technical point, just to for those listeners who are precise about details, smokeless powder technically burns really fast. It doesn't explode. Yeah. Really fast, like so fast that
it creates a lot of gas very rapidly.
It simulates an explosion,
shell, which simulates an explosion.
Yeah,
very, very much creates that pressure, which then, because the bullet is not fully attached to the casing, that's the weak point, and the pressure pushes it out.
Yeah. So a process. Now you're talking about a 20 gauge. Now this becomes interesting later on. We'll talk about it. But 20 gauge shotguns are typically junior shotguns. Like most adult shooters gravitate toward 12 gauge. There is a 10 gauge, which is brutally like it's. I think some police departments used to use them, like rural, like Texas and all. But you'll bruise your arm with 3-inch magnums on a 12 gauge. When you're talking 3 or 3.5 inch on a 10 gauge, it's like a cannon.
They interestingly, way back in like the 30s, they used to mount 10 gauges on the front of boats for duck hunting, like on a swivel. You wouldn't put it up to your arm. You just turn and you pilot your boat towards ducks, point it, pull the trigger, and your boat would go back a little bit.
Yeah, 10 gauge is a serious weapon and really impractical. I mean, maybe like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime could handle one, but yeah,
from the hip,
right? Yeah. But 12 gauges certainly have a lot of punch. The 16 gauge will be the next popular gauge, moving smaller, and then there's 20. And then one of my favorites, 410, is a common one of that, which is a pleasure to shoot. You can shoot it all day.
It's like the 22 of shotgun rounds.
It's almost a perfect shotgun, not for self-defense, but just for
target shooting, for clay shooting. Yeah,
yeah. 410's all day. 12 gauge though is the one. It's common and very affordable. You can. So 20 is a gauge where you tend to think of a junior shooter operating that weapon, not a hitman or whoever else becomes relevant in this case. So as you mentioned, Mike, Jeff wasn't there. He was 17 at the time. He was at Great America Amusement Park near Chicago. 13-year-old Jackie was visiting friends at a college that was close by, and Jessica was 9. She was having sleepover. So fortunately, three children not involved when whoever entered murdered everybody. So the police, right away, now I think this becomes pretty crucial, they started focusing their investigation on 17-year-old Jeff Pelley.
And they kind of indicated that to neighbors, saying, we've heard this in other cases too, like with Michael Morton, saying, you've got nothing to worry about, kind of indicating this is not someone that's going to come around doing other things. We know who it is, was kind of the indication there. And that's pretty telling. right? That they do that tunnel vision, like we talked about before, and set their sights on one person, and therefore miss details that perhaps might lead them to another suspect.
Yeah, we saw it in Michael Morton. We covered where the police were visiting every day
Right.
and kind of telling the people in the neighborhood, yeah, we kind of, without saying it, they were like, we kind of know. We're not so much interested in the identity, just information you might have about that person.
Right.
That's definitely where they were going. So we see now, they come to motive, and this, of course, becomes an issue as well. Jeff didn't always get along with his father, and there was an incident, there was a few incidents that occurred prior to this. Jeff had been caught burglarizing a home. He'd taken $100 in cash and 40 CDs. Now, CDs, brand new, in 1989. Like, this would have been like big
Top
deal.
notch. Yeah.
I'm surprised anybody in a rural town would have had 40 CDs in one house in 1989.
Now, this was a friend of Jeff's, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So even not only that, but a teenager had 40 CDs.
Reminds me of the movie Back to the Future when Marty went back in time and said that he had 2 TVs. And they're like, what?
Reruns.
Nobody's got 2 TVs.
What's a rerun?
That's right. What's a rerun? So this got him in trouble, obviously stealing. The police agreed not to arrest him as long as he apologized and returned the property, which he did. But obviously Robert was not pleased.
The friend actually said he didn't care about the money. He just wanted the CDs back. He's like, as long as you get my CDs back, I don't care. Like, we're even.
Yeah,
And
like
so,
apologize for it and
Right.
give the CDs back. Yeah.
And from what I understand, like, it wasn't ever that the police were going to, like, the police weren't really going to press charges at that point. It was like Bob found out about it and took Jeff to the police to kind of scare him, to try to, like, hey, you could get arrested. And then they talked to the family friend and was just like, yeah, just give me the CDs back. So there was no prosecution in this case. There was never really any real threat of prosecution in that case.
No, which is very common for rural areas in the Midwest in that time frame. That also would have been pretty normal. You have police officers that weren't as concerned about permanent criminal records, and also they lived in the communities, and they really didn't want to cause trouble except with true troublemakers. Now the system is much more punitive. It's much more about get them a conviction, get them convicted, so that way we know they're a danger and all this stuff.
But yeah, Bob was understandably upset about the actions of his son.
Yeah, he was not pleased, so he refused to let him attend a dinner before a prom that was coming up. Right?
Initially, from what I understand, he said he's not going to prom at all. Like, everything having to do with prom is done. Like, you're not going to prom, you're not doing anything. And then slowly over time, he kind of relented to, okay, you can go to prom, but you can't go to the dinner beforehand, and you can't go to the after party, and you can't go to Great Adventure afterwards, because that was the whole plan. The big plan for prom was we go to dinner beforehand, then we go to prom, and then we have an after party at a bowling alley, and then we go home and sleep, and then we go to Great Adventure the next day.
Do all the activities.
All the activities and everything. But Bob was like, you can go to prom, but I'm driving you. Like, I'll drive you there, drop you off, and bring you back.
So we have kind of 2 points of embarrassment, maybe not from Jeff's perspective, but one, Jeff had a silver 1984 Mustang. Yeah, that's rough. Although at the time he probably thought that was the coolest thing ever, right?
Yeah. It's only 5 years old. Like, it's not like it's 30 years old
Right.
at that time. Like,
I guess from a mechanical point of view, it would be embarrassing, but from his point of view, it was probably thrilled to have a car at all, right?
He would have much rather, I'm sure, had a Mustang that was close to 30 years old. Like, if he could have gotten one from the mid-'60s or so, or late 60s, I'm sure he would have much rather that. But at 17, you're happy to really have any car for most kids.
I was.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was happy with a 1993 Geo Tracker.
And you should have kept it, Mike.
I would have if it hadn't gotten destroyed. But
Is that a pull start?
no, it was Kickstart. Like, by Kickstart, I mean, I put my feet down through the thing and did the whole Flintstone thing. Get it running.
So the second point of embarrassment was that his father was going to drive that car with Jeff in the passenger seat. Right, so that's, silver Mustang and his father driving.
Depending on the particular story that we get from neighbors and other family friends. It wasn't even going to be in Jeff's car. It was going to be in Bob's car, which everybody recognized Bob's car.
Even worse.
Yeah, because Jeff had a few days before that had gone to the neighbors and had asked if he could borrow their Trans Am, because that was classic. At that point, he was going to roll up in style with his date and the Trans Am to prom. And his neighbors were like, yeah, sure, that's fine. And then Bob came by a few days later and said, you're not letting him drive that car. What they told Jeff was, as long as it's okay with Bob, sure. And Bob came by and said, no, he's not allowed to do it. In fact, he's not going to drive anywhere. I'll be driving him. He's not even driving his car because I removed something off of the car. He's never going to get it running again.
Yeah, I think it was a distributor cap and 2 fuses, at least, that Robert had removed from the Mustang. And he canceled the insurance on it. And this was something the police checked out.
Right.
And he had done that. And Robert, according to people who knew him, would not have operated a vehicle without insurance.
But there were some indications that, like, Jeff had a job. He was working at McDonald's.
Right.
And there were some indications that the reason the insurance was canceled was because Bob wanted Jeff to get his own. Wanted him to pay for his own. So the insurance was canceled with the understanding that Jeff would get his own insurance, and Jeff just hadn't done it yet.
Right. So it might have been Robert thought it was insured or thought it was going to be insured.
It's possible. It's also possible that he just was like, nope, canceling the insurance.
Yeah. So that becomes important as well.
One of the things that we would learn from one of the daughters, Jackie, I believe, was how Bob would go about handling discipline. He was very hard at first, kind of, you're grounded for the rest of your life kind of thing. And then they would work it out afterwards. That was his pattern, right? The kids knew it. They knew how that went about, how Bob went about that every time. It sounded like, at least most of the time.
Yeah.
So he would deliver this discipline, and then they would talk about it. Bob would kind of, realize I was just doing too much there, and kind of backtrack on that. And that's what we see here, based on what we've heard.
Yeah. Jeff actually mentioned that in his taped interview with the police.
Right.
Was that was what Bob would do. Is basically like, as long as you're doing good, as long as you're doing what Bob wants you to do, he'll back off and do that and let you do the thing eventually. And Jackie would also say the same story independently. And even Jessica at one point would say the same thing. Like, that's what she noticed of him. Mm-hmm. And that just shows that that's a pattern of behavior for him. So when the police hear that from Jeff later that, yeah, Bob said I could go, they didn't believe it. Mm-hmm. But it fits with the pattern. Right.
Yeah, and so that's why, we heard about this, you're not allowed to take the car. You're not allowed to go, I'm going to drive you. I'm going to disable the car so that you can't, this and that. But we see a lot of reports later from various people saying that Jeff took the car, and so then you try to piece together the pieces. Does that mean that Jeff went without Bob's knowledge? Or does that mean that Bob knew about it and Jeff went with Bob's blessing, right? That Bob was aware of it and was okay with it. And so we hear, eventually the story is just, Bob knew about it because Bob was there when Jeff left in the car, and Bob was alive when Jeff left with the car. So Bob must have known about it and must have been okay with it. Otherwise, being a stern person that he is, would have prevented Jeff from going, as he had done by removing parts on the car.
And what speaks kind of to that is the fact that Jeff was able to leave in the car.
Right.
And we know he left in the car. He was seen driving the car. He showed up to his girlfriend's house in the car. They drove to Great Adventure in the car. They got to prom. He was driving that car that entire weekend. When they got to Great Adventure, his car was there. And the police searched it. The car was running. If Bob was sure that Jeff was never going to get that car running, then he's the person who would have fixed it to make it able to run, which speaks to that pattern of, well, I'm relenting and letting you go do the thing because you've been doing well since this point to this point.
So this brings us to this 20-minute time range that we talked about in the opener. First, I do want to mention that the shotgun was never recovered. No matter who operated it. There was in theory, a shotgun and some type of bow. I don't know if it was a long bow or a crossbow that was hanging on the wall.
There's a compound bow. There's a picture. There's a picture.
Okay.
There's a compound bow on a gun rack on the wall in Bob and Dawn's bedroom, and there's an empty slot beneath it. And there's contention as to whether the 20 gauge shotgun was there at the time or not.
On the 29th.
Yeah, on the 29th.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would become a point later. We'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, Robert did own a few guns. I think he actually bought or sold guns that very day. So now looking at the 20 minutes. So on Saturday, April 29, 1989, this is when the police thought the murders took place. Again, it was Sunday when all this happened with the key and the upset church members finding the bodies. April 29. So the bodies, it's theorized that the victims were murdered between 4:50 p.m., when one witness reported that she left the parsonage, and 5:10 p.m. when another witness said Jeff's Mustang was still at the parsonage. They believe that Jeff committed the homicide, all the homicides, in 20 minutes. And this is again, like I mentioned, this is their story.
Yeah.
This isn't the defense hemming them in. Mm-hmm. They're admitting this. They're confessing that their case is terrible.
Yeah. And it's even worse than that, because the recollections of the individuals at that time, what's actually written down from the girl, her name is Kim Oldenburg, and her date, David. They'd been there to have their picture taken by Bob, because he had a 35 millimeter camera, really professional type of thing. So they wanted to have their pictures taken. So their recollection is that they were there, they last saw Bob and Dawn alive sometime between 4:40 and 5 p.m. Right? And Matt Miller, who is one of the other witnesses there, said that he was the one who said he saw Jeff's car in the driveway. He said that he was there at 4:45, and he stayed for about 5 minutes before he realized that he left his date's corsage at his house. So he left to go get it. That was at 4:50. When he left, Kim and her date were still there at 4:50. He drove for about 15 to 20 minutes to get the flowers and then back. And he said that sometime between 5:15 and 5:20 was when he passed the parsonage again and saw Jeff's car in the driveway.
Right, still there.
Still there.
Right.
When Kim and David, Matt, and the girl he was going to prom with drove back past the parsonage around 5:30, Jeff's car was gone. They all say that. It was around 5:30, Jeff's car was gone.
Yeah. And we know that he was somewhere else by then anyway.
Yeah. We know that at precisely 5:17, he was at the Amico station, which is 4.3 miles from the parsonage.
About 6 minutes.
About 6 minutes, yeah. About 6 minutes.
Yeah, where he stopped to ask for a screwdriver or tools or something to try to get his vehicle, his Mustang, running.
It was idling high.
Right.
It was idling really high. He mentioned that several times. It was idling high. Which, I mean, sure, you could have helped him fix that if you'd become a mechanic.
If I'd only been there.
If you'd only been there, been able to help with that.
And he called his girlfriend, Darla, while he was there as well, saying that he was going to be late. And he called at the gas station.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is pretty crucial for a number of reasons. This gets, I think, into the mental health piece quite a bit. So you have a disorganized 17-year-old that had a history of petty crime, impulsivity, irresponsibility, low conscientiousness. This was not somebody who could get a task done properly. That seemed to be the community's primary complaint about him, right? So magically, on this particular day, in 20 minutes, he carries out all the tasks necessary, and I think, Mike, you have these, all the tasks necessary to commit these murders and leave the crime scene as it was found. Right. So let's think about this as Mike goes through this. We're talking about 20 minutes, and again, a 17-year-old who had a persistent reputation as not being able to achieve any type of meaningful tasks.
Right. And supposedly, he planned all of this. The police say he planned all of this days beforehand. And then he follows through on this. First thing is he packs his tuxedo for easy transport. This can have virtually no time impact on anything going on, because that can be done beforehand. Mm-hmm. That could have been done in the afternoon. He packs his tuxedo up. He's ready to go. First thing he's got to do, lock all the doors, draw the curtains. That can take, in that parsonage, anywhere between 2 and 5 minutes.
Let's add
and he's got to do this without Bob and Dawn becoming suspicious of, why are you drawing the shades?
Right.
Why are you locking on the door?
They're
Why are you locking on the
alive.
doors?
They're alive at this point.
Yeah, they're alive at this point. So he also has to load the shotgun. It depends on how many shots he puts in it. Typically 3. I think that Jeff at one point said you could get up to 5 in there.
Yeah, Mossberg 500, I know in 12 gauge, well, it depends on the tube length.
Yeah, it depends on the tube length.
But usually a 3-inch Magnum, you're putting 4 in the tube, 1 in the chamber. 2 3/4 inch, you can do 5 in 1. Right? So 20 gauge is a different, it's
20 gauge
obviously
is
a different
completely
size.
different, but from what Jeff said, 5. Get a most 5 in there. And depends on the shell size too.
Yeah, what length was he? What size brass was he using?
So if he loads 3, 15 seconds or so to open, drop 1, close it, and then put 2 more in. Longer if he puts additional shells in. Okay. So he then has to kill Bob. 2 shots. Anywhere between 15 and 30 seconds. And the way one of the medical examiners called it out was he shot him in the chest. Bob falls down, still moving. He walks over top of him, points down, pulls the trigger again. That's why 15 to 30 seconds. Then he has to chase Dawn. Apparently she's upstairs, or she's come upstairs because of the sound. And he chases her, fires a shot, and misses. That's anywhere between 10 and 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. Then he's got to reload the shotgun because there's 6 shots fired out of a 5-shot gun. So he's got to reload. He has to reload at least 1 shell.
Right.
At some point. That could be anywhere, again, 15 to 40 seconds, depending on how many shells he's got to reload. Then he's got to get downstairs, kill Dawn, Janelle, and Jolene. 3 shots each, or 3 shots, 1 each, from a distance of 1 to 3 feet. It's anywhere between 6 and 30 seconds. Then he's got to find all 6 shells. Conservatively, really rapidly, I give a minute to police the brass, to find all the shells, because he knows where he is. Mm-hmm. He's at home. Then he's got to strip out of his clothes, his bloody clothes, because he's standing only a couple of feet away from his victims that he just shot in the head. All 4 of them, supposedly. Strip out of his clothes, put those clothes in the washer, add detergent, start the wash cycle. Anywhere between 2 and 5 minutes. I mean, I can do that pretty quickly, but still might take me a couple of minutes to strip out all of my clothes, throw them in the washer, grab the detergent, throw it in there, start the wash cycle.
And that's if you're okay with touching blood and things like that?
Right.
And presumably, again, talking about a 17-year-old that was not experienced murdering people, murdered his family, is going to have adrenaline, running loose. He's going to, be missing buttons and stuff when he's trying to undo his shirt or whatever he was wearing.
Even if he's pulling it up over his head, trying to get the detergent out, and like liquid detergent, trying to get it in the rain. Maybe he just poured some in. That's why I said 2 minutes, maybe.
Could have been, yeah. He had to have been shaken.
Yeah. After that, after he gets the wash cycle started, he's got to shower. He's got to take a shower. This is 10 minutes. I gave 10 minutes for the shower. Not because I think that he had to shower for an incredibly long period of time, but because there was no visible blood in the tub when police investigators got there. So he had to have cleaned the tub afterwards. Mm-hmm. So 10 minutes to clean himself up, get all the blood off of him, because nobody said they saw blood on him anywhere. So he's got to get all the blood off of him and clean the tub so it's visibly clean. Soap at the time had phosphates in it, so luminol tests were inconclusive for the presence of blood anywhere in the house other than where you could actually see the red dried blood. So he didn't have, and he may not have known this at the time, but he didn't have to clean it till the point where it was bleached clean and not able to be detected, because they wouldn't be able to detect it anyway, as it was. He then has to put on new clothes, his Hawaiian shirt and blue jeans. Mm-hmm. Again, 2 to 5 minutes to get dressed, because he's also got to put socks and shoes on, everything. So 2 to 5 minutes to do that. Then he's got to take his tuxedo, the shotgun, the rags that he used to clean the tub. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were some wet washcloths left there, but the rags he used to clean the tub he would have had to take with him as well. All the shell casings, got to take those out to the car without touching anything bloody again to transfer more blood onto himself. And lock the parsonage behind it. 1 to 3 minutes to do that. Mm-hmm. It takes multiple trips. And somewhere along the way, he has to dispose of the shotgun, the shells, and the rags somewhere between his house and his girlfriend's house.
Somewhere where investigators
where they
would
couldn't
never
find it.
Would never
find it because they still have never found it. And even if it's prepped beforehand, 2 to 15 minutes. Okay? That leaves us with a time window of, at minimum, if he's moving absolute fast as he can possibly move, doing everything the very minimum amount of time that I've allotted here, 21 minutes.
I counted 22 based on what you said. So, yeah, absolutely.
The longest period of time that it would have taken, if it took him the longest amount of that I've allotted, 47 minutes.
Which is the way that teenagers do things.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially non-trained killers.
Which means the mean time is 34 minutes to carry out this whole list of things. And this, I'm pretty sure I may have forgotten some of the things he would have had to have done.
Well, under the prosecution's motive theory, he also had to replace the fuses in the distributor cap, unless he somehow could do that before, with his father not seeing.
Yeah, I didn't include that in because he may have been able to do that. He was seen by neighbors washing his car that afternoon.
So he could have.
And playing with Jolene and Janelle, like squirting them with water and things.
Yeah, would you wash your car if it was completely disabled?
Right.
It wouldn't make sense.
It wouldn't make a lot of sense.
What are you trying to do? Like, what are you trying to show?
Why are you washing your car if it can't go anywhere? If Bob's not going to let you drive it at all because it has no insurance and you're not and has been disabled, why bother washing it?
If you don't need it to look presentable at prom or something where you would want it to look nice, why even wash it at all? Yeah.
Right. But he was seen that afternoon washing the car. And so it's possible he could have, if Jeff did it and fixed the car, that he did it around that time, earlier in the afternoon.
Right.
So I didn't include that on the list. But I may have forgotten some things. I may have been overly generous in some of the areas. I may have overestimated how much time it could take to do some of these things. But in general, 21 to 47 minutes is the window of time it would have taken to do all of these things, to kill these and get away with it. Now, I timed out from the witness statements, if there's some minor discrepancies in the times given by witnesses, he would have had at most 28 minutes to accomplish all of this stuff. And that's only if Kim left at 4:47 p.m. If Matt's right and he drove past at 5:15, then Jeff was driving 120 miles an hour to get from the parsonage to the thing. That's 28 minutes. Realistically, though, it comes down to about 17 minutes.
You would have been idling really high then.
You would have been really idling high at 120 miles an hour. But if Matt's wrong about 5:15, and Jeff didn't speed through, it takes approximately 6 minutes. So he would have had to leave the parsonage at 5:11. If Kim was right in saying 5 o'clock was when they left the parsonage, that's 11 minutes to do 21 minutes worth of work. I don't see it.
Yeah.
And even if they left right at 4:50, then Jeff would have had to have been locking the door behind them as they're going out. And again, it doesn't, like, yes, the time technically works out, but he's got to be perfect on it.
And he wouldn't have known that they had that much time either.
No.
Yeah, he didn't know when the friend would be driving by.
Right.
So, or if somebody else would drive by, like he had no way to gauge that. So after Jeff does this incredible murder, I mean, a murder that would put him in a proficiency of like master assassin, master ninja assassin, he acts normally at his prom.
Yeah.
No one noticed anything out of the ordinary except some statements he made to his girlfriend that seemed a little fatalistic, but I mean, a lot of 17-year-olds.
That would be the next day at Great Adventure.
Mm-hmm.
He would say, I can't help shaking this idea that something bad happened at home. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, 17-year-old, they say things like that. Like,
well, one of the other things that would come up throughout this case was one of the daughters saying things like Bob was very paranoid in the years since they had moved to Indiana. And, that could really play a part in this, because depending on what Bob would say, and he would cry right in front of them and really say things like, if we're not here anymore, if we're gone, here's what you do, or here's who's going to take care of you, things like that. So Jeff might have already had an idea, a sense of that. Bob very likely also had a sense that something was wrong and maybe was a little bit more paranoid that day as well. They talked about they had pictures taken not too long ago for the church directory. Bob would say to that photographer, I don't want our pictures taken. There's somebody who's out to kill my family. So he knew about it, right? He knew something was coming. This was known knowledge to Bob. And also that same day, a neighbor would say that there was a black pickup truck in Bob's driveway, and she saw Bob right around 5 o'clock talking to this guy in the black pickup truck. Now, we said that this is a small town. You know everyone in this town. Right. The neighbor didn't know this person and thought it was kind of odd. Like, here's an outsider talking to Bob. Now, he's the town minister, so maybe that's not as abnormal. But she was able to trace her time, having gone to stores, showing the receipts and saying, here's the time, here's how long it would have taken to get back, right down to about 5 o'clock, which, if that's true, means that Jeff couldn't have done it, right? So there's a lot of factors here that not only say Jeff couldn't have done it, but also say Bob might have known something was coming, might have indicated that to Jeff. He also went to the gun store that morning, Saturday morning. I had heard he didn't buy anything, but he was looking to buy something. That leads me to believe Bob knew something was coming, was looking for a little bit more protection. Maybe didn't know it was going to be that day necessarily, but Bob had the thought and was maybe a little bit more paranoid that day because of it. So maybe that's where Jeff got that from.
But what's interesting about that particular witness who said that they saw the black truck was if you trace all of the stuff, the minimum time she might have been pulling out of the driveway and seeing Bob was 4:50.
Yeah.
Sometime between 4:50 and 5 p.m. If you include her statement that Bob was outside the parsonage and as early as 4:50, then again, the prosecution's timeline goes away.
Right. Still doesn't work.
Because the time when Kim would have had to been walking out the door and Jeff locking the door right behind her, Bob's outside on the driveway. How do we get this timeline back? It's going to take at least a minute for Bob to get back inside. And that's a minute that Jeff just doesn't have.
Now, something else unusual, there's many things unusual with the prosecution. Then we'll get to kind of Robert's backstory. But we see that friend that had to go get the corsage, Jeff invited him into the garage to hang out. Why would you do that if you're about to commit a quadruple murder?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense at all.
Unless you're a sociopath. But yeah, it doesn't jibe. Jessica would be the one to tell police where Jeff was. Very confidently too. It wasn't I don't know where he is. He might be at Great Adventure. You know, that he might have gone there. It was, he's at Great Adventure. Jeff's at Great Adventure and Jackie's at the college. She knew exactly where he was. And that speaks again to she knew before she left that Bob was going to let Jeff go do these things. And Jackie said later that she knew before she went to the college to visit a friend, Bob was going to let Jeff go.
And it wasn't, she knew Jeff was going to sneak out and go there. It was Bob
was going to let Jeff go. Jeff called his girlfriend on Wednesday. This happened Saturday night. Wednesday, Jeff calls up Darla and goes, his girlfriend Darla, and says, Bob's going to let me go. Don't really tell anybody because, it might upset Bob if everybody knows beforehand, but we've kind of hashed it out. He's going to let me go do these things. So they rescheduled dinner and everything around this. That was the point that prosecutors said, see, this is where he planned it out.
Because he told her not to say anything.
Because he told her not to say anything, and he told her that he was going no matter what. Jeff planned it out.
Yeah, very, very weak. Now, so moving to kind of the alternate theory. So this is another thing that the prosecution made a big deal of. Look, we don't have a good timeline. We don't have a good suspect, but no one else could have done it. There was no motive for anyone else to do it. But there actually might have been a motive for somebody else to commit the crime. It looks a lot like a hit.
Yeah.
And we know that when Robert was in Florida, there was some suspicious dealings he had with apparently a Colombian cartel. A group well known for not liking their money taken.
Yeah. Landmark Bank had a lot of dealings with the cartels, and Landmark Bank was kind of known at the time. I was investigated several times over the years, eventually shut down, and it was a front. Like, it was a money laundering thing using their computers. Mm. It's likely that Bob could have been involved in that or found out about it and became a liability for it. Mm-hmm. The other area was the very influential family in the area, the Hawleys. The Hawleys and the Pelleys were very, very close. They'd gotten really close at the time Bob met the patriarch of that family, Phil Hawley, in like 1979 when he was living there. Joy was still alive. They became very, very close. There's some hinky stuff with the Hawleys after, like right around 1988, late 1988. Especially stuff involving a guy named Eric Dawson, which is this is another murder that ties into this.
Mm-hmm. Very similar to...
Right. So Eric Dawson's a land developer in Florida.
Could have been you.
Could have been
you.
Not in 1988. I was 7 years old at the time.
Well, I wouldn't want to limit you at all.
You could have started early.
I could have started early. But
use some of that like money you got from birthdays or something.
Right. Possibly. I might have even been able to be as successful as Eric Dawson was, which is to say not very. He had a lot of failed projects, but he ended up making friends with the Hawley family, and they ended up investing millions of dollars with him. And he started, so he had some failures, and then he had some successes. And he was starting to have some successes, and then September 9th of 1988, he vanished. His family went looking for him. The Hawleys helped look. They ended up finding his car at the airport a couple of days later, and then the police investigation went, oh, he committed a lot of fraud and just left with a whole bunch of money. Like he just skipped town, and they stopped looking. And it would be November 21st when his body was found on one of the properties that he owned. And he'd been shot in the head with a .22 caliber handgun. And that, I think, is one of the most important things for this. Because Bob Pelly had a lot of guns. Right? He traded guns, had guns. The Mossberg gun was bought in December of '88 for Jeff. But there was an incident with, 87. The Mossberg was bought in '87, December of '87. There was an incident in the spring of '88 where Jeff wanted to kill himself. And he specifically had a .22 revolver that he was going to use.
Yeah, a favorite weapon of mafia for hits. Yeah.
Yeah. But he had this .22 revolver, and it was special to him because a friend of Bob's, it had belonged to that guy's father, and he'd inherited it when his father died, and he didn't want it, so he gave it to Bob. And Bob gave it to Joy, and it was one of Joy's favorite gun. And when she died, it went to Jeff. So it's kind of an heirloom. Jeff really liked this particular gun. Mm-hmm. But after this suicide attempt, like everybody talked about it in the house, like Jeff he wanted out. And Dawn and Bob and Jackie all talked everything down. And Dawn was like, I want the guns out of the house. She told Bob, get the guns out of the house. So Bob packed up all the guns and got them out of the house. Gave them to a guy named Thomas Kebb, who was never called to testify at any trial. Thomas Kebb said he took the guns and he knew that there was at least one shotgun in amongst those guns. There's a shotgun, a rifle, and a pistol. But it wasn't the .22 revolver, because Bob said that he was going to keep that for Jeff and give it back to him when he was ready.
Right.
And he gave it to somebody. Didn't tell Jeff or anyone else who he gave that pistol to. Just gave it to somebody. That was in spring of '88, right? Eric Dawson killed with a .22 revolver in September. By January of 1989, Jeff and Jackie both say that Bob said he had the .22 revolver back. It was back in his possession, but it wasn't in the house. He was absolutely convinced. He was adamant on that. He said, I've got the revolver back. I'll give it back to you when you're ready, but it's not in the house. Interestingly, the Hawley family was tied to criminal things going on with Eric Dawson. Not his murder, but theft of land fraudulently. They had taken photocopy of his signature and put it onto a quitclaim deal, and then filed that 3 days before Eric was killed. Okay. Investigators in Florida on April 1st, 1989, served 2 warrants, one of them on Phil Hawley's home, looking for evidence of this fraud. I find it very interesting, the timeline. April 1st, these warrants are filed, are served. These things happen, and then less than 30 days later, the Hawleys are killed. And that there's a .22 caliber in both of those cases. Or the Pelleys. The Pelleys are killed, yes. My mistake. The Pelleys are killed less than 30 days later.
Right.
And there's a .22 caliber gun involved in both of those families. And the Hawleys knew exactly where the Pelleys lived. They'd visited them many times. Jeff and Phil Hawley's son were best friends. In fact, after the murder would happen, Jeff would go live with the Hawleys for a long time. They would be a really big part of that case. And it seems like if they were involved in the murder, I'm not saying that they were, but it's reasonable for me to say, if they were involved in the death of Eric Dawson, that .22 pistol could have been the murder weapon. And then it was given back to Bob to get rid of it and kind of get it out of there. And then they were worried that Bob would turn it in, so they killed him. They came to get it, to try and get it back, and Bob didn't give it to him or them, and he killed them for it. And that Dawn and the kids were collateral damage. That's as reasonable an explanation to me as Jeff doing it. In fact, it's more reasonable to me because the whole "he wouldn't let me go to prom" is a terrible motive.
Yeah, it's not a great motive, especially considering, all the business we're talking about with the vehicle. Like, that vehicle was running, as we talked about. If it was running, it was probably Robert who put it back in working order. Yeah, but there's a lot. I mean, there's a whole confluence of evidence that comes together that makes it look like Jeff was just at an amusement park. Went to a prom amusement park. That was it.
Just being a teenager.
Yeah, he was normal. He acted pretty normal. So after all this, the investigation, in the beginning of the investigation, he was interviewed. Jeff was interviewed. I think his grandparents were with him.
Yeah, his grandparents, his maternal grandparents, his mom's parents.
Right. And we see this, these images, and this is what the police are saying, he didn't have any emotions. He's cold as ice. Definitely a killer. Or a typical teenager with his grandparents being interviewed by the police. Like, I didn't see a massive distinction.
He went through 2 different police, being in custody, not officially in custody, but he was being held by police for 2 different organizations before he got back to Lakeville. And the first one that told him that his parents were dead, he started sobbing. Like, when they told him, "Oh, your parents are dead," he started sobbing. His girlfriend was there. I can understand by 12 hours later, when his grandparents are there and they're trying to interview him, he's kind of cried it out, I guess.
And he'd also been taught his whole life not to cry.
Right, don't cry.
So for him to even cry, that would have been pretty significant to really break that character that had been imprinted on him.
If he could have cried in that moment, I don't think he would have been tried.
No.
I think that was a huge deal. I think what happens, in the absence of a good case, the police start reaching. And they always like to reach into our profession. They don't reach into physics or biology, mental health counseling. Let's reach in here and pretend we know what we're doing. And it's always the same story where, they're not acting right. And that automatically means they're guilty. It couldn't be just another version of not guilty. It has to be, we're flipping over to guilty.
Right.
Jeff was described as surly, which the definition I found, bad-tempered and unfriendly. And that fits that, right? So, I mean, especially if you've just been given terrible news that your parents are dead, that your dad and your stepmom are dead, and as well as stepsisters. And you're also being held in for questioning from police, with your girlfriend. Other people are being questioned. You're being there for hours, lack of sleep, probably not a whole lot of food going on too. So he's probably just very uncomfortable at that point, and the terrible news of his family being killed. And on top of that, he's got this personality that just wasn't really conducive to being perhaps likable by some people, maybe based on that description. So yeah, he's liable to act in a very different way from what one might expect to begin with. Add on top of that, most of your family's dead now. And now I got to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? And how am I even going to act? I don't even know what's going on in my life right now.
Mm-hmm. And good.
Yeah. So we see that, here's a point I would give to the police in terms of, as they kind of put this together, trying to figure out who did it. Jeff really was quite unlikable. There's pretty wide agreement about that. Again, 17-year-old, rambunctious, not a good supervisor, like his father didn't do a good job supervising him. But he was unlikable, and he did have a pattern of criminality that seemed to be escalating. There was this incident where he took money from the women's auxiliary group at church and had to make an apology, and then, of course, the CDs, and a number of other small, Mickey Mouse stuff. But this is what we see in people who later commit murder. We see this antisocial behavior. I think he really looked like somebody, especially from the police point of view, that was going to be a criminal someday.
Now, I will say that he was unlikable to adults of the time because he actually had a really large group of friends. He had a steady girlfriend for a long time. They had a bunch of friends. He had other friends who would talk about talk about him. Like, he invited the Matt guy to come in and just hang out. Like, he had friends. He had a social circle that really liked him. Like, he had people who liked to say, he wasn't unlikable to everyone. He was unlikable to the adults in the area.
Yeah, to the only people that mattered for his convictions, sadly. Right? They looked at him as future criminal of America, or of Indiana anyway. And I think, I would give him that point. Like, I get it. Like, the small criminality, especially, not learning the lesson and continually jeopardizing his freedom and violating the rights of others. He looked like a good suspect at that level. Not at any of the other, not in the world of physics, but just in the world of temperament. I can see where they're like, this is our guy.
Even though they suspected him, and they didn't charge him in 1989.
Right, he goes for years.
They wouldn't charge him for another 13 years.
Yeah, he goes for years, and he did get in some more trouble, right? He moved to Florida, and he seemed to be doing okay, had a job, I think a romantic interest, like it was going well. But then something happened with the money he was supposed to get, some inheritance, where he essentially committed another crime.
Right.
Medical insurance fraud.
Yeah. He and Jackie, and I believe Jessica, all had a trust of the life insurance money and whatever else Bob had from his estate was left over. But it was in trust. None of them were supposed to be able to touch it until they were like 23. I think it was, or maybe it was 26. But he was under that age. But he needed a bunch of money. Like, he wanted to have his share of it, his money. He's like, I'm an adult. I can take care of myself. I can take care of this money. I want this money. It's mine. And he kept trying to ask for it legitimately. And the manager of the estate, the manager of the trust, was like, no, you're not old enough yet.
Which was Don's father. By the way, his stepmom's father, so his step-grandfather, I guess.
Something like that.
I don't know how you would say it, but Don's father.
Yeah. So one day he calls up Dawn's father and says, I've got skin cancer. Same type as his mother's. His biological mother had, Joy. And that doesn't sit right. And so he keeps asking for, like, who's the doctor? Where's the hospital? Like, give me more information. And so Jeff provides him with some information, and he calls. He calls, and like, it doesn't sit right with him at all. So he calls the FBI, and they look into it, they investigate into it, and he's eventually brought up on fraud charges, medical fraud charges, on a federal level.
Yeah, it seems like something. I'm surprised they would have even pursued this crime. I mean, he lost his.
They only pursued it because the police who investigated Lakeville pushed him to. The one investigating officer wanted to be there in Florida at the arrest when they took him into custody.
Yeah.
John and Mark, who had investigated the Pelly murders.
Right.
Yeah.
They wanted to be there, and because they wanted to trip him up. They wanted to try and use this to trip him up into a confession in the murders.
Yeah, which never happened.
This was an interesting thing, that Jeff presented this $20,000 medical bill to Dawn's father and said, here's the bill, and he'd forged this information, put doctors' names on there. Dawn's father looked into it, and that doctor was not employed by the hospital. So of course that's like, well, this doesn't make sense, And the weirdest thing, I think, this is pretty deep. Jeff had set up a phone line in his house, had his mother-in-law answer the phone. When Dawn's father would call, the mother-in-law would answer and be able to give some information. But then, of course, she wouldn't be able to, go to a supervisor or go to somebody else, give other information. And it was pretty elaborate, but, I don't know, that's pretty terrible, too.
Yeah, he really wanted that. He really wanted that money.
Yeah.
And I think, this kind of speaks to the repeated criminal behavior of Jeff that the police are using as their major leverage.
He's not helping his case.
No, he had escaped. If he had done it, right, he had escaped prosecution. So then he walks right back in to fraud. Like, why would you do that if you got away with it? Just wait a few years and you'll get the money. Right. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, I guess you could argue that because he did that, maybe he was less likely to have committed the homicide. Like he felt that he, had a lot of credit built up. He could do things like that. So eventually, Jeff Pelley is prosecuted for 4 homicides. Yeah. This incredibly flimsy case, which we've talked about in detail, was used, and the jury was mesmerized with ideas of guilt.
And I think one of the things that got them was I think the one piece of circumstantial evidence that really finally convinced prosecutors to move forward was Jessica. When she said, I saw that Mossberg pump-action shotgun in the parsonage, in Dawn and Bob's bedroom, on that gun rack, Friday morning before I left. It was there. It was in the house. And of course, it's not there afterwards. In 1989, both Jeff and Jackie independently said that shotgun hadn't been in the house for months. Mm-hmm. Jessica said 13 years later, I'm sure it was there.
Right. It's worth noting that assassins could have grabbed the shotgun. Guns are valuable. Right? They could have just taken it. They could have taken it and used it. Yeah. But yeah, the memory thing, the 13 years, and another 2 kids saying it had not been there for a long time.
And this is from a woman who has admitted, and even in a book that she wrote about her life, that she has severe memory problems surrounding that event. That she in one of the interviews she said, I think it was the 48 hours one, she said it was afterwards I found out that I had DID.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I'm like, if you have dissociative disorders are all about memory. If you have a memory block or memory issues surrounding this, how can a jury rely credibly on your recollection of that shotgun being there?
Yeah, she was 9 years old at the time.
She was 9 years old at the time.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because I think that's an important story in this narrative. So we know that Jackie supports Jeff's innocence.
Absolutely. She runs a website based on trying to get him out of prison.
Justice for Jeff.
Yeah, Justice for Jeff.
Right. And Jessica, according to 48 Hours, which is what I want to talk about, they really made it seem like she believed that he did it. But I found some of the language that she used a little odd. Almost like, and this isn't a quote, but almost like she was saying, I've now come to believe it, like I've realized it.
Yeah.
Usually, this is something you would just know, not something you would discover many, many years later.
Right. She stated in many interviews that she's done, she stated that the morning that things happened, she was brought back to the church on Sunday morning, and she saw the crime scene tape, and the mother that had brought her back got out of the car, talked to police officers. They took her out of the car and just said, your family's gone. And she was never told details about anything that happened. And she went to, I think Dawn's parents, I think it was, and she went into foster care after that at certain points because she was acting out severely. and whatnot. But she would say that for years she thought that Bob had killed Dawn and her sisters, and then himself. That she thought it was a murder-suicide thing for years. Mm-hmm. And that about 5 years after the events happened, or 6 years, she was 15 years old. Jeff got back in touch with her. She'd been in foster care and wanted her to come down to Florida where he was living. He brought her down for a weekend. And there's been different stories, and depending on which interview you read. In some, she says, as soon as I saw him, he asked, "Who do you think killed Mom and Dad?" Or killed my dad and your mom, because Jeff refused to call Dawn mom, like ever. But other interviews, she said that they met at the airport, they went out for dinner, they went back to the house, she was getting settled in, and the last thing he said before she went to bed was, "Who do you think killed my dad and your mom?" And that one to me is more believable. And she, of course, said, "Well, I think your dad did it. And it was a murder-suicide." And he would, and then just left. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of years later, when the police would talk to her and they would ask her the same question, "Who do you think killed it?" And she said, "Well, I think it was Bob did." And they're like, "That's not possible. Bob was shot twice. Like, you can't," and the gun wasn't ever found, so it's not possible for Bob to.
They have a good point with that.
They do.
Yeah.
They do. And then they were like, "Well, who? If it wasn't Bob, who else do you think?" And she was like, "Jeff." Like immediately. Mm-hmm. It had to have been Jeff. And that was when the prosecutors were like, okay.
Good enough for us.
So 48 Hours is a show on CBS. And I've seen many of them. I would say probably almost all of them. I'm a big fan of what they do at 48 Hours. They a show like that is 44 minutes, something like that. They can cover a case and some of the peripheral things pretty well in that time.
Yeah.
It's an excellent show. The episode with Jeff Pelley isn't a bad episode, but it's uncharacteristic in that it's only one side of the story.
Yeah, I would say it's not about Jeff Pelley. It's about Jessica Pelley.
And her journey and her finding her friend. And I'm sure that's all, and that seems wonderful.
Yeah.
But it has very little to do with the circumstances of Jeff's guilt or innocence.
Right. Now, there's another show that I watched that included a lot of Jessica's side of things, and it speaks to a lot of the stuff about Jeff earlier than that. But it also conflicts with some of the witness statements. Jessica said that Jeff was always mean to her when they were growing up. That he did things that were really, really mean and nasty to her. Like she recounts one time when she and her sisters were in a tent in the backyard, and it was nighttime, and they were telling scary stories, and they heard a scratching at the front of their tent, and then the thing gets opened up, and there's a guy with a ski mask there. She opens it. Jessica opens the tent. The ski mask is there with a bright light on his face, and she screams, and he grabs her and pulls her out of the tent and runs back into the house and throws her up on the counter and takes the mask off, and it's Jeff, and he starts laughing hysterically, which to me is something a 15 to 17-year-old boy would think it was absolutely hysterical. It's the kind of thing I would have done to little cousins. And it's relatively harmless prank. But to hear Jessica tell it, that was the most traumatizing thing anyone could ever do, and it just proved that Jeff was evil. Evil, evil, evil.
Yeah.
She also talked about one time when she was in the shower and he opened the door and grabbed her clothes and took the clothes and closed the door while she was still in the shower, so she didn't know.
Right, like it was some creepy, sexually motivated.
No, it was funny. Like it's objectively, like for 15-year-old boy, funny, especially if he sees her as a kid. Now, some of the neighbors said that Jeff didn't get along with the girls. That he only got along with Jackie. But one, the fact that he was playing with the girls washing a car that day speaks against that. But they also were like, he was the neighbors, these same neighbors, like he was pulled back from them. He never hung out with them. He was never there. He was always separate, on his own, doing his own thing. Except that Jessica and Jackie both say that since he was the oldest boy, he was the oldest kid and the boy, whenever Dawn and Bob wanted to go out and have a date night or had something to do out, Jeff stayed home and had to watch the girls. And that happened relatively frequently. You don't babysit for your little sisters, your stepsisters, all the time, regularly, and not get attached.
Yeah, it seems more like she was told he was guilty, and then she had to frame her memories to fit that narrative in order to find some type of peace, right? Just to make sense. And it's easy to side with law enforcement. A lot of people are agreeable, and they tend to think the police tell the truth or prosecutors tell the truth, which sometimes they do. I mean, I think they generally try to, but they get it wrong a lot. But people don't think that. People think, no, it must be, the official narrative must be the correct narrative. So it's easy to go along with them.
At this point, they're 3 years. I'm gonna get my timeline right. They're 3 years into being a blended family, or is it 4 years?
I think it's 3.
They got married in '86, or was that when they moved?
They married November 8th in 85.
85. Okay.
They married in November 8th, 85.
November of 85, right?
And then they moved in 86.
Yeah,
And they moved
February
in
85 is when the mother died.
Yeah.
And then they met in April and May.
Yeah, and it was April 89, so it was just over 3 years.
Okay, so 3.5 years ish or so. They're a blended family. I'm not part of a blended family. I don't think you guys are either. I don't know what that's like to assimilate into a blended family. I can't imagine it's very easy, especially after having to deal with the death of a parent, and now you've got this new parental figure that I don't know that they necessarily expected, Bob or Dawn expected either side of the family to say, call them mom or dad or be perfect about this assimilation into the family unit. But I imagine it's pretty difficult. So to the point of the kids not getting along, I think that makes a lot of sense. Here you have a teenage boy, has a history of criminal behavior, at least bad behavior, and he has to join this family. Now they're blended. They have to figure this stuff out. Here they move after a year. They're being pulled away from friends, still trying to deal with the loss of a parent and the grief of that. And here, parent gets married less than a year after that death. There's a lot going on there. A lot for anybody to deal with. Especially, if an adult dealt with that, that would be pretty big. But especially for teenagers, young kids, that's a lot to deal with. So the memory that Jessica has, I imagine, is just very difficult for her to come to terms with. Trying to understand the relationship she has with Jeff and Jackie, and trying to figure out she's never had a brother, and now all of a sudden she does, and trying to figure that out. He acts very different than I think what she was used to, and just boys in general do, versus girls. There's just behavior differences. So there's a lot going on there that's going to heavily contribute to how Jessica is handling this situation. And so it makes sense that she sees this in such a different way than perhaps Jeff and Jackie did. They were being older. They were older at the time and might have been able to deal with this a little bit better, but she's being 9 years old and obviously younger before that, had even more to deal with to try to understand this scenario. So, there's I think that's a really deep story for her. There's a lot of depth there that she had to deal with at a young age and is still trying to come to terms with, especially having been in foster care and all the things she dealt with after the murders.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're talking about a 9-year-old saying that she saw the shotgun. So a 9-year-old witness, I would be pretty skeptical, even if that was 2 days after.
Right. I would be too.
Yeah. Just because, a 9-year-old, like we've seen many cases where kids say things that just are not true. And, they're easily manipulated by the police or anyone who's talking to them. And then they stick with that. And then, a jury will think, oh, it's true because they're sticking with it. But they're embarrassed because they know they lied. Not that she knows she lied or she did lie, but, not reliable. 9-year-old witness is not reliable. And does a 9-year-old really know what a 20-gauge shotgun is?
I did, but
yeah.
I was shooting guns when I was like 6.
Yeah. Most 9-year-olds.
Most 9-year-olds. She might have known it's a gun, but... Yeah. And realistically, looking back 13 years after the fact, it might have been something she was used to seeing there and has a recollection of seeing that shotgun. But I don't think we can rely on the fact. I can't rely on my thoughts 13 years ago looking in my house. Like, I don't even remember what kind of furniture was in my living room 13 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And I lived in that living room like daily. Like, I don't know which couch it was. Like, I couldn't pinpoint it. Was it the gray one or was it the brown leather one? Like, I don't remember. I can't go back 13 years ago. And 13 years ago, I was in my 30s. So, late 20s, which is more better than 9 years old.
To your point, Mike, I think we all probably have memories of when we were younger, single digits age, when we would come home and something might be different. Parents rearranged, they bought a new couch, got rid of one, etc. And there have been times that I can remember that something changed and I didn't realize it until a week later, sometimes more. And, that's the kind of thing that siblings make fun of you for. You're like, hey, wait a minute, what happened to this couch? And they're like, you idiot, that's been gone for weeks. And you're like, oh, all right, So it's quite possible that something like that came into play, especially because, of course, if you know that this object is going to be important, well, yeah, you're going to be thinking about it. But this object had been sitting there on the wall for some time, and maybe it wasn't there at the time, but it had been sitting there. And those aren't the kind of things you pay attention to. It's just the normal everyday activities, and you're not necessarily focused on that. And then you think about it later and realize, was it there? Wasn't it there? I'm pretty sure it wasn't. I'm pretty sure it was there. But there's a lot of room for error there at that age.
Yeah.
Memory is really malleable. And there's a thing to speak to that point. There's a thing we call inattentional blindness or change blindness that magicians take advantage of all the time.
Yeah, right.
Like you can be staring right at somebody and then look away and they change something about them and you look back and not even notice that anything changed. Mm-hmm. It happens all the time. Like people change the color of their shirt. The magicians will change the color of the shirt, put on a hat, change like everything. And you'd think, oh, I'd notice that. No, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
not if it's done well enough.
Aren't there little drawings in like the newspaper and stuff that have like find like the difference between the two? Even when you're staring at it, and there's something different.
Right. It can be really hard to pick that out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think that Jessica's testimony on that is very unreliable, but the jury ate it up.
Yeah, they were, like I said, they were mesmerized. This was a case that did not seem particularly close. They really believed that he was guilty, and they stuck with that, and they convicted him. He was sentenced to 160 years, so he's going to have to stay fit if he's going to get released. Mm-hmm. That's a long time.
Going to have to stay around.
Yeah, now, he might be able to get, I don't know what Indiana is for a good time. Every state's a little different. Usually good time's something like 15% off. So, whatever that would be, not much.
Not much time.
I mean, total amount of time would be high, but he'll never get out of prison. Yeah. Interestingly, in 2008, his conviction was overturned.
Yeah.
On appeal. It was a great success. Things were looking up. But then it was upheld by the Indiana Supreme Court a year later. So
he tasted the freedom.
Yeah. Well, he was never actually released from.
No, he wasn't
from prison. He was kept in prison during that time period.
Yeah, which is interesting because usually when the conviction's overturned, that means the presumption of innocence is back. So,
but there's the whole case was circumstantial because there's major problems with the physical evidence. Like there's the prosecutor's timeline that, hey, this had to have happened between this time period and this time period is based solely on the house being locked up, not based on time of death. Because the medical examiner didn't get a time of death. Mm-mm. It could have done a liver temp thing, but the bodies were all taken and put into cold storage immediately, which dropped the body temperatures and made any kind of reading from liver temp pointless. They wouldn't have been able to determine. Fortunately, they didn't try and use digestive stomach stuff to try and determine the time of death, like we saw in Michael Morton. But interesting, the stomach context actually was interesting to me. Mm-hmm. All four of them had what was described as a light brown liquid and fruit in their stomachs. Bob also had kernels of popcorn in his stomach. Now, Jackie would say later, this is a thing Bob did nightly. Every night was have popcorn. He had an air popper and he would pop popcorn every night. You'd have some popcorn, and you'd have the bowl left over. And while he was getting ready to make the popcorn that night, he would finish up what was left over from last night. And there's a video of the crime scene from the day, and there's actually if you catch it, you can see that there's a bowl of popcorn on the counter with some popcorn still in it.
Right.
Jackie said that he always had the popcorn later in the evening, sometime around 7 o'clock, 7:30. Sometimes if he was going to give the younger girls some of the popcorn, he would have it at 7 so that they could have some. If they were going to watch a movie, he might pop some for the movie. But he definitely had ingested some popcorn. But the interesting thing to me was that brown, when I first was hearing about light brown liquid and fruit, what is that? I was trying to figure it out. Like, first I'm thinking, like, is it yogurt and fruit? There's breakfast time? And then I'm like, no, this happened in the evening, right? Nobody mentions anything. But to me, it finally hit me one day. I was like, banana split. Like, banana split has multiple types of fruit and vanilla ice cream and chocolate ice cream, or vanilla ice cream and chocolate sauce, right? So the chocolate sauce and vanilla breaks down to a light brown liquid and different types of fruit. I'm not sure exactly what types of fruit it was. It's not indicated in the report. It just says fruit. But it makes sense. And all 4 of them had the same stuff, except for Bob having the popcorn. It indicates,
and ground beef, too.
Right. The ground beef was in the lower intestines, I do believe. So they had, they all had banana splits. But there's no mention of, like, the banana split fixins in the home. Like, there's no reference. They might have been, but the police didn't think of it because they didn't know what, the medical examiner would find later. Mm-hmm. But it speaks to another thing, like, maybe the reason why at 5:50 p.m. when people showed up that evening, they found that the house was locked up and the shades were drawn, was because the remaining Pelleys had left. Maybe with the guy in the black pickup truck. Mm-hmm. Drove out somewhere to get ice cream. And that person killed them when they got back.
Mm-hmm. It's quite possible.
Yeah. I don't know when else they would have been able to enjoy that. Nobody said that, hey, when we were there having our pictures taken, everybody was having banana splits. So there was a Sunday bar going on. Like, there wasn't any mention of that anywhere. So where would that have come in? That, and all of them had it in their stomach. So everybody had some. It makes sense to me, and that's another thing that brings out the reasonable doubt. But the oversights by the medical examiner really killed a lot of the ability to get a good timeline.
Yeah, this was a case where the timeline was offered by the prosecution, and the jury believed it. Now, maybe the prosecution had the timeline wrong, and they should have done a different job to try to get the conviction. But, as I've said several times, this was their timeline. They provided it, and the jury went along with it. And Jeff Pelley's actually in prison, essentially, functionally for life. Mm-hmm. And now this was the Indiana Supreme Court. I'm sure there will be an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but, the U.S. Supreme Court hears very few cases. So it's not, you can't count on them hearing a case at all. So, and I don't know if there's any intermediate. There might be an intermediate between...
I think they have another. They're trying to come up with some other stances based on Brady violations and things that the prosecutor didn't turn over.
Right. You can revisit
at the time.
Right. You can revisit it in the lower courts if you have something new.
Right. So I think they're trying to bring in some Brady stuff, and the podcast Counterclock, which is actually wonderful source. It was one of the most detailed podcasts on this particular case. I'd highly recommend it. It's 20 episodes long. They're all about a half hour, so it's really a good time crunch and good time investment to put into that. But it's super detailed. The investigator in that for that show actually brought the stuff about the pistol, the .22 caliber revolver, and the connection with Eric Dawson. Brought that to Jeff's appeals attorney. And she had no idea. And she's now going to be trying to try and figure out if they can use that and help with that. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that 2 completely unrelated cases ended up exonerate. Michael Morton did the same thing, like a completely unrelated case helped exonerate this person. And, it could be possible. If there was a Hawley connection between them, we might find that out. But barring an actual investigation into those things and finding that gun or finding the murder weapons for the Pelly case, it's likely that Jeff is going to spend the rest of his life in prison, unfortunately.
I don't see him getting out. And, we've talked about before, getting a conviction overturned. I mean, the time to win is during your trial. I mean, sadly, and the United States criminal justice system prides itself on definitiveness. Victims, every stakeholder gets an answer. When the jury says what they say, it's over, right? If they say not guilty, jeopardy's attached, it's over. If they say guilty, realistically, you're going to be guilty forever. Although technically, a verdict can be overturned. A guilty verdict can be overturned. It's 4% of the time, something like that. So it's usually when something dramatic happens. Even the Michael Morton case, there was plenty of evidence not to convict him, plenty of evidence to overturn the conviction, but they had to get a lot together. They had to find that whole other murder and connect it. I mean, it seems insane that they had to go that far when it was clear that Morton never did it, and he didn't do it in reality.
Right.
Like we now know that there was another killer in that case. Yeah, I think Jeff's going to do the full freight. Well, he won't do all 160, but he will die in prison, most likely. It's very sad.
I don't know if either of you guys heard it, but there was a follow-up to that Counterclock season. And if I remember correctly, they know where that .22 revolver is at.
Oh, I had not heard that.
Yeah, there was a question and answer kind of thing, a follow-up to that third season. Investigators or the lawyer, somebody knows where who's in possession of that .22. They didn't give any more details that I remember, but that's a pretty big deal, right? Because that could potentially connect the cases if there is a connection, or at least give some more details to it, give some more information. So this one's interesting because it happened in 1989, and of course he wasn't convicted until many years later, but it's still ongoing. They're still finding new information, new connections, and this is another case where, and we've seen this before, where somebody had an interest in this and brought it to light through media, right? We saw that with Kristen Smart. Mm-hmm. That was something that for many years didn't have a whole lot of activity. And then here a guy makes a podcast just because he's interested in it, not because he has any stake in the game, but just because he's interested in it. And, well, here you have a lot more information, and it leads to arrests. It leads to more conclusions in the case. Here's another one. You have a very popular podcast that comes out, and it leads to more things. More connections are made. More people are involved. There's more public interest as well, which therefore kind of puts more pressure on investigators, on police, and to do something about it. So it's an interesting thing, and I'm sure that Jeff is very thankful for that interest. Assuming that he's innocent, I'm sure he's very thankful to have that interest so that he can make more headway towards an innocent and overturn in the conviction. So I don't know. I think it's pretty cool. I think it's cool what people are able to do to influence this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that really helps somebody who is actually not guilty in prison is money and interest. Right? You need really both. Mm-hmm. And we see that. Like, people are interested in helping him and trying to find the truth. Something else to consider, he could be guilty, right? Just because the prosecution had an awful case doesn't mean he wasn't guilty. We've seen that before, like where they say somebody's guilty for all the wrong reasons and they turn out to be guilty for some other reason. Like they get the motive completely wrong or the time of death wrong, but the person still did it. This case is interesting. So, Mike, you said in the beginning, you're all the way.
I'm on Jeff's side. Like I honestly think that Jeff didn't do this. Like just looking at so many different inconsistencies in the evidence that was presented, it's completely circumstantial, everything. And I think there's enough reasonable doubt given all the other connections and possibilities. It doesn't fit. And as much as he was getting into trouble around that time, it was all petty stuff. it was penny ante stuff.
Yeah, he wasn't stabbing people or anything.
He wasn't getting into fights. He took $100 and some CDs from a friend of his, and he'd taken some money from the women's auxiliary. Those are more like super impulsive kind of things, and yet he supposedly planned out this. Like this sounds more like a kid with severe ADHD who's trying to deal with his mother's death even a few years later, struggling with a dad who's strict, maybe not overly strict, maybe a little, but he's got a strict dad that he knows how to manipulate, because who doesn't? He knows how to manipulate his dad. He knows what's going to come. Why bother killing him? If he knows what's going to happen, if he knows what the pattern is, he has no reason to kill him.
There was no motive either way.
All of these things that he's done before that are all impulsive. It's all, oh, hey, look, there's money.
Yeah. And
it's in my pocket.
He largely escaped any consequences.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't strike me as something that he did consciously pointed out, like he wasn't, on his way to being Ted Bundy or Ed Gaines. Like he was not on his direction. He wasn't turning out to be a sociopath. He had some troubles. Yes.
Yeah, I think he was on his way. I mean, I think there's a possibility he was on his way to a life of petty crime. I mean, look at the insurance thing. I think it's a classic example. You beat the murder charge, whether you did or not, and then you go and try to steal $20,000, sort of, right, to fraud. I think he was a criminal, right?
Some of the things that he did afterwards, though, really are some of the things that indicate to me that he didn't. Like, he didn't immediately leave Lakeville. He got an apartment there in town, like closer to town. And he stayed in contact with the primary investigator.
See him every so often.
He'd see him every so often and be like, hey, how's it going? I got a new job over here doing this. He'd stay in contact with him. And that investigator would think, that's weird. Like, it's not.
Not really.
To me, especially in a small town, and you're the investigator on his family's murder, it wasn't that he was doing the classic, like what Jodi Arias did, like, how can I help with the investigation? He's just like, how's it going? Didn't even inquire about news on the case. He just wanted him to be there and be available and have a connection to the investigator. So just in case something does come up and we learn something, he's going to be more comfortable coming and telling me. And in fact, Jeff in his interview said he wanted to be a prosecutor. Like at that time, he's like, I want to be a prosecuting attorney. I want to become a lawyer and become a prosecutor. I was like, okay. But
yeah. I think a lot of people look at his pattern of behavior, as I mentioned, and think he was on a bad path. But there's versions of bad. There's degrees of bad. It's one thing to be, I picture this as like the guy who would steal from you when you turn your back, but not necessarily who would shoot you when you turn your back.
It seemed to all be about money anyway.
Yeah, impulsivity. He wanted what other people had, and he didn't want to wait or earn it. That is a far cry from a mafia-style hit. If he got in a fight with his father and injured him or something, hit him with a bat or whatever, okay. But shotgun and killing kids doesn't seem to fit with that pattern of criminality, the one he seemed to be heavily invested in when he was young. And he might have outgrown it. A lot of people commit crimes when they're 17, don't commit crimes later, like after, say, 30 or 40.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we see by the late 90s, he's married. At some point he has a kid. I'm not sure when that child was born, but late 90s, him and his wife bought a house for $500,000. By 97, they had a rough patch in their marriage, but they worked through it, reconciled, and were doing pretty well into the 2000s. He was ironically working for IBM in computers. And so,
jet setting around the world too. Like
international.
He was doing international stuff.
Right. So, by the late 90s, he was doing pretty well. Now, was he still, not telling the truth with certain things, or was he displaying any kind of behavior like that? Possibly, I don't know. But for him to be in a very successful career like that, a successful marriage, not the whole time, but they did well with it, and have a child as well, that speaks to something. Perhaps to your point, Dr. Grande, about growing out of it or realizing the error of his ways and doing something different with that.
Yeah, it sounds like he had some antisocial tendencies when he's younger, and sometimes those are life time, right? But other times, people realize that they're not going to get what they want doing that. So it's just a matter of consequences. They start obeying the rules because they can get what they want more efficiently and repeatedly, consistently by being lawful.
Especially if he's making a lot of money at, by all means, a good job.
Yeah. So, who knows? I mean, again, this is what they're latching on to, and I think they were able to sell it to the jury. I don't buy it. So,
I don't either.
But let you go first, Jeff. So Mike's saying he's on the innocence boat. Mike's sailing away on the innocence boat. What do you think?
So, one thing I've been thinking about was, you talked about the podcast, Counterclock. Her name's Delia, and she had involved, and I might be getting the details wrong, but she had involved a retired Pennsylvania, I think, detective or investigator or something.
Just a state trooper.
Was a state trooper? Okay, yeah. So somebody involved in some level of law enforcement to get an opinion on this, right? To try to understand from somebody who has dealt with these things for many years, what's your opinion on this? Interestingly, his conclusion was that Jeff did it, was that Jeff killed his family. And I didn't expect that, frankly, because, kind of everything we saw kind of pointed to this, I don't think he did it. That was the impression I got. Now, Delia was very careful to say, I don't know if he did it. I'm not going to make any kind of conclusions here. But I thought it was very interesting and worthwhile that she would bring somebody on to present another opinion about this, one that was contrary to a lot of things that they had talked about in those episodes. So when that was introduced, I was like, no, Jeff couldn't have done it. But when that was introduced, I was like, well, wait a minute. I have not seen the evidence firsthand, at least not all the evidence that was available. I don't have any background in law enforcement or investigations or anything. I don't know if I have the best perspective to really make a determination. So if I'm thinking that Jeff didn't do it, but this guy who has much more experience than I ever will says that he did do it, I don't know. That makes me more confused now. I'm still definitely on the side of I don't see how Jeff could have done it. Nothing to me indicates that he possibly could have. But I had a lot more doubt after this guy's opinion was introduced than prior to that. So if I had to give a percentage, I would be 75 or 80%. Now I'm gonna say 90% sure that Jeff couldn't have done it. I just don't see how it would even be possible. But there's that 10% based solely really on what that retired state trooper said, that 10% of me thinks maybe I'm wrong. And maybe I just don't have the right perspective to really understand what exactly happened here and how it could have happened. So I'm still going to say 90% Jeff couldn't have done it, didn't do it. Innocent.
Okay. Yeah, actually innocent. I'm torn on this. I'm very skeptical. I've mentioned this many times. I'm skeptical of the police, skeptical of prosecutors, because this is the case we hear about. How many thousands don't we hear about where these mistakes are made? And take any investigation they do, and you're going to find horrendous mistakes, even the ones where we know the people did it. Right? Even like Jodi Arias. We know she did it. They made mistakes in that investigation too, bad ones. That could have cost the whole conviction. So I'm naturally skeptical of them. At the same time, I'm skeptical of this guy. He wasn't getting along with the dad. They happened to die when he's away, like during that window, and he did have kind of a criminal buildup there that was going on. It might not have indicated he was a murderer, but it could have. I'm torn. I think there's a reasonable chance he did. I would probably be like 30% chance he did and 70% that he didn't. And my theory would be based on the prosecution screwing up their own assertions. Like, I think they may have found him guilty for the wrong reasons if they had presented a better case. But I think, what they're saying, if what they're saying is true, then there's no chance he did it. Right? And that's the point of reasonable doubt, right? Like, there's reasonable doubt no matter how you look at it. 30% guilty that's reasonable doubt. According to research, reasonable doubt is usually defined as between 90 and 95% sure. So they're nowhere near that standard. Mm-hmm. So I think he could have done it. probably didn't. But either way, I think the investigation was horrible. And I don't trust a thing coming out of the police or the prosecutors in this case. Not a thing. They have no idea what happened. They have no idea what happened. And that's reasonable doubt. If you don't know what happened, that's reasonable doubt.
And that's the thing. There's conflicts between the investigators, between investigators in the case. There's, a group of investigators and prosecutors saying that they've pulled his jeans out of the washing machine with a receipt and a dollar bill in perfect condition, still in the pocket, and a whole bunch of pocket change still in the pocket, which I don't believe. There's a whole bunch of pocket change. It wouldn't have stayed in the pocket. But putting all of that aside, the FBI examined those pants and said, these pants have never been washed. There's no trace of blood on them at all. And they're slightly soiled. Like they've been worn and not been washed. So investigators are conflicting with investigators and prosecutors and on the same piece of evidence. And they can't keep track of, like, where did these jeans get picked up? Were they actually taken out of the wash, or were they picked up from Jeff's trunk? Like, there's a whole bunch of problems. And it's just, I find it's so problematic that the investigation is just bad. And that same state trooper, I think he said that there were two possible scenarios. There was one shooter. It might have been a different FBI investigator who said it, but there's two possible scenarios based on the shotgun shells.
Right.
Well, it was the defense attorney at his trial, so there was two possibles. It was one shooter who had two different types of ammo and loaded up, or two shooters, each with a different type of ammo. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you start throwing that in, like, there's doubt right there. And I just think there's so much doubt and so much conflicting evidence, and the timeline doesn't fit. I don't see how it could have been possible.
This was just a kid who happened to fall into some bad circumstances. His family's wiped out, and they point the finger at him. But if you break this case down, right, there's no video of him committing the murder. There's no eyewitnesses. There's no confession. At 17, I would say probably a 50% chance there would be a confession in a case like this if he was guilty. No murder weapon. They never found the weapon, even though it had to be on a very constrained route for him to be the places where we know he was. I mean, did he throw the gun like a mile? Like, is he like superhuman? I guess he is if he did the murder.
When asked about that, investigators like, well, maybe he didn't just get rid of it before he got to Darla's house. He did it when they were on their way to Great Adventure, so it could be somewhere closer to Chicago.
Yeah, I guess he could also
gotten rid of it.
Duct taped it to a vehicle or something, and it took off, or whatever. Or a very large bird, pterodactyl. I don't know. Like I feel like they're making stuff up at this point. He made it into a rocket and fired it into space.
Any chance we can bring in pterodactyls is, I mean, right. we're pretty well set.
Maybe the alien lizard people are like,
that's what it is.
Come here, I'll take care of that gun for you. We've been looking for one of them.
Get rid of it.
Yeah. So no witnesses, no video, no confession, no murder weapon, no DNA or blood on him, his clothes, his vehicle, nothing.
Nothing. No bruises on hhim. Like medical examiners and doctors said, like if he fired that many shots that rapidly in that period of time, he'd had bruises on his shoulder. The day after they took his pictures, no bruises. Yeah,
and I've heard the argument here with the bruises, right? So bruising is a very individual experience. Mm-hmm. There's people that can bruise with a 20 gauge. There's people who won't bruise until they move to 16. I've seen people who don't bruise with a 12. Like, I don't know how, because I do. With 3-inch magnums, like 5, 10 of them, I'm bruised. Not a lot, but it's there.
It can also depend on what's on the backstop.
Is it rubber?
Is it rubber? Is it cushioned? Also, like it could be the day. Like I've shot 12 gauge skeet for hours and had no bruise, and then I've gone and shot 3 shots and been like, I can't anymore. Just kicked in the shoulder by a mule off the same gun. Just at different days. Like it depends. So the bruising thing, but it's another one of those things where it's no evidence, and a lack of evidence is not evidence.
Yeah, I mean this is one where they had to fill in a lot of the puzzle. Like it came with like 4 pieces out of 1,000, and they're like, well, I think this piece should go here. We don't have it, but let's just draw it in anyway. It's a car. Oh, it's a house. We'll just draw it. Like, it's just, they're making stuff up.
Yeah.
They don't know.
Right.
And, you know, this is one of those cases that really shakes your faith in the criminal justice system in the United States. This is horrible. This one makes no sense. I get that people think that he did it. Like, again, I think he could have done it. But guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, I don't see in a million years. Mm-hmm. I just don't.
It makes me wonder what the jury, what everyone saw at the trial, and how the jury would have been convinced about that. You know, was it an emotional kind of thing where they really pulled to the emotions of, you know, killing a teenager, killing his family, and how terrible that is, because obviously they didn't get it off of evidence, right? They even said, we don't have evidence. We don't really have a timeline, and the timetable is really tight, you know? So they really went against themselves, like we were saying. So they had to really, really pick out something to make the jury like really super convinced, like you had said, that he was guilty.
I really do think it was a rhetorical argument, that it was he's the only one who could have done it.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And he was angry. He was an angry teenager, and this is why he did it.
Yeah.
And they went with, they really reached out to the emotions of the jury and pulled them in. And I think that those are some of the worst arguments, since we saw in Michael Morton. Mm-hmm. That's what got him convicted.
The disgust. The sheer disgust of something now that no one would even care about. Right?
With the weed whacker. Took out her marigolds with a weed whacker.
Like, fart letter.
Like but the sheer disgust from stuff was really spoke to the rhetoric, and that's when the jury was like, nope, yep, he's guilty. Like, he didn't do it.
No.
There's no evidence he did it, but they did it. And to speak to Jeff's point about the investigator, again, Michael Morton was a case where, like, investigators who have, you know, decades more experience than you or I will ever have in investigators, they pushed Michael Morton, and we know he didn't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No,
that's where I get the distrust for the law. Like, the law enforcement officer, maybe he's really good at what he does, but it is a matter of opinion because we don't have the evidence to back it up.
But he's still human.
And he is still human.
Right. So we're liable to make any possible mistake.
Where they often fail is critical thinking skills. That's what I've noticed. Like, a lot of them are good at, like, okay, I talked to this person, I'm going to document that. You know, I went and had lunch, I'm going to document that. I mean, whatever. Like, they're good at, like, here's where I was and here's what I saw. They're very, in my opinion, in many cases, very poor at interpreting the evidence and really thinking through the possibilities. They also tend to focus on one person in the beginning, and then every domino falls into place to support that. Again, they're making the pieces of the puzzle. They're forcing them to fit. And we've seen cases where investigators have brought up concerns, like multiple investigators, and one will be concerned, and the other ones will start shaping the narrative to fit the concerns and the new discoveries around the same person, like not expanding it. Oh no, they weren't there at 5 o'clock. They must have been there at 6 o'clock. Like, just make stuff up because they really want to convict a person that they believe did it in the first place. Mm-hmm. This is the ultimate example of that. They didn't like him from the beginning. It took them 13 years or whatever it was. And more than that, he was convicted in 2006, right? So to get him convicted would have been like 17 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I think it was like 13 years before they talked to Jessica.
Right.
And then
it
took them a little bit longer to really pull things together.
Build the case.
And he was arrested like shortly after that, and it took him a couple of years for them to go to trial. He was even not in the country when they did the arrest warrant for him for Florida, and they went to his house and he wasn't there. But because he had the murder arrest warrant, when he came back in through U.S. Customs in Los Angeles, they had the warrant and they pulled him aside and then took him back to Indiana.
Yeah, so, I mean, he's never going to get the sympathy of somebody like a Michael Morton who's been proven not guilty, but imagine with Jeff Pelley, like, imagine what he's going through. I don't think he actually did it. And this, again, certainly they can't prove he did it. And he had a life, and that is gone. It's over functionally. Like, it's, practically speaking, it's over.
And he's got a child who is growing up. Again, I don't know what age, but is growing up without his father. Whatever stage of life he's in, he's still growing up without his father being there and having to visit him in prison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to be thought of as someone who could have done this. Like, for people to believe that you did it. Mm-hmm. And then you don't have to say allegedly because he was convicted. But I consider it allegedly still because I didn't see the evidence to convict him.
Right.
It's alleged crime.
He's 50 years old now. He still had a lot of living to do, right? He still had a lot of things that he could have done career-wise with his family. I'm sure he was looking forward to I'm going to assume that he was making some good money at that point, based on
He's flying all around the world. Yeah,
right. Good money he was making in the 90s and early 2000s. So I'm sure he was looking forward to retirement. Yeah, not within maybe 15 years or so of right now, but maybe 20 years or whenever it was. But I'm sure he was just looking forward to living his life. Essentially, is what I'm saying. And yeah, you're right. It was taken from him, and there's no matter how this turns out. So even if it is overturned, he's lost a lot of that by that point.
He might be able to make it out if it gets to over 200. You just got to hold on. Mm-hmm. Just get up there. 210. He could be walking out, wheelchair wheeling out. Unless he finds a way to cryogenically freeze himself while he's in there.
That's worthwhile, I think.
It might be.
Yeah, I don't know what his conditions are. I don't know if he's in like a 23 hours in, one of those things, or if he's Gen Pop or whatever, but prison, either way, ages you dramatically. Ever see those pictures of people, like I'll be doing these videos and look at the photographs when they went, say they did 20 years, and they get out and they're like, oh, this person's out. Can you believe they're out? And they committed a murder or whatever. And you look at them and like they're 50, maybe 60. They look like they're 90. Mm. And there's some warden will get on there and get on the news. Well, prison ages these prisoners dramatically.
Well, yeah, when they don't have air conditioning in the summer and
yeah,
their medical care is iffy at best.
Yeah, every service is abysmal in prison. Mental health care, physical health care, food, HVAC and air conditioning, heat, whatever, rats, attacks from other inmates, everything. I think that's part of the punitive element, but that's based on society being correct, right? Like we put the right person in there and we want them punished. What if it's not the right person?
Like Michael Morton.
Yeah.
We know he wasn't the right person, but he was been there for 25 years.
He was 100-degree heat. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Now, for what it's worth, even if somebody is guilty, I don't think those conditions are reasonable.
I don't either. I think that our penal system fails on the basic premise of rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. The penal system in the United States, especially with the for-profit prisons, doesn't rehabilitate anyone. It's not based on rehabilitation. It's based solely on housing outside of society. Mm-hmm. It's separation from society only. And what we should be focused on is that rehabilitation aspect.
There was a case not long ago I covered. I think the young man's name was Cameron Herron. It was the Too Pretty for Prison case with the street racing in Florida where he killed a woman and her child. He's going 100 miles an hour in a Mustang GT. I think it was at 2018.
It wasn't a 1984.
No, it was a 2018. No, okay. No, 100 miles an hour. Yeah,
that was the giveaway.
Right. Yeah.
And the judge, who I think did a good job in the case, was kind of doing the sentencing deal, and said in Florida, prison's punitive. Like he didn't say this, but read between the lines. Rehabilitation is not our mission here. The sentence is to make you suffer, and make you suffer good. And he was sentenced to 24 years. I think he deserved that. But just the idea, I don't think the judge was being mean. I think he was reading from the law. Mm-hmm. Like, it's punitive. Our system is to punish you. We don't really care if you get better. We don't really care if you had an excuse, if you want to turn your life around. That's great. Do that in your time. You need to serve this time for punishment only. Very much different than many of the European countries.
Which is why recidivism would be so high. People going back into prison because, if you're spending all that time there and you're not getting any better, there's not the focus on that. Well, it makes sense. You're just going to go right back in. You haven't learned anything and you can't get a job after you leave anyway. Right. So what are you going to do with yourself? You're just going to feel like you need to commit more crimes to be able to live some kind of life.
Yeah, well, in prison you learn how to be a better criminal. You're surrounded by other people who also want to learn how to be a better criminal. And you have a permanent record that society can never forgive, not our society. There's the ban the box. There's some efforts, but basically, a lot of people are okay with the idea of a permanent criminal record, even though scientifically it makes no sense. People love it.
I think, and it's really the hard on crime stuff. Like you want politicians to be hard on crime,
right?
But hard on crime should be let's make sure that our system can rehabilitate people and get them back into active in society. Not let's see if we can, find a way to lock up everybody and throw away the key. That doesn't fix anything. It just leads to overcrowding. It leads to systemic racism that we see in not just in the United States but other nations that have a similar punitive system. We see all sorts of inhumane and inhuman treatment of human beings. But as soon as a person is convicted, you're a con, not a human being.
Yeah, that's it.
And for some, because especially the for-profit prisons, you're a number, not even a human being.
Yeah,
you're dollar bills.
Whether you're like 99% guilty or 51% guilty or whatever, it doesn't matter. You're labeled, and that's it. Our system, I think succeeds in some ways. Rules of evidence and all, I think generally are a good idea. The reasonable doubt standard, but in terms of the punishment, it's awful and lazy. It's intellectually lazy. We want the blood. We get the blood. Oh, we got him. Like it's revenge, but revenge isn't going to help improve society. There's no scientific reason to believe that revenge is the way to go, but it satisfies the bloodlust, which I get. Like I get why people who have victims in their families or they are victims want revenge, but that's an individual desire, and we've turned it into a societal desire.
And I agree when it comes to when cases go to actual trial, evidentiary proceedings, the necessity for proof beyond reasonable doubt, innocent until proven guilty. That's all wonderful, but the plea agreement system in our country is such that 97% of cases end in a guilty plea because of plea agreements. We don't ever get to that point where we have evidentiary standards that have to go.
We couldn't try everybody.
No, we couldn't.
Yeah, people would not live long enough to make it to.
But then there are a whole bunch of crimes that go to the courts that we shouldn't have to have as criminal actions in the country. But it's one of the reasons why police are told by prosecutors to put as many possible charges on for anything. They overcharge everything because then prosecutors have the ability to leverage down some of those cases.
Yeah, and Delaware, where we live, is notorious for overcharging. Like you do one thing, and it's like you get 16 charges. It's a conspiracy to do that thing. You had a tool to do that thing, right? You thought about one time doing that thing before. Like they're just making up stuff.
There's a ski mask in your closet. Therefore you had a mask, and that's burglary. And
that's for the thing.
That's for the thing. It was you were planning on using it for the thing, and they put so many charges on there. But then the prosecutors drop it down. There was a case I'm intimately familiar with. It was a friend of mine. The charges were like huge, like felony level, like 4 felony level charges, like Class A felony, like they were big charges. And the prosecutor was willing to drop down to like a Class C misdemeanor just to get that guilty plea. And to me, if I'm a lawyer, I'm going, let's take it to trial. Like this prosecutor has nothing. He's willing to drop these charges from here down to the basement, to the bargain basement. Let's go to trial. But a lot of lawyers, their gut reaction is, yes, I win because I get it down to this level, and my client only has to do 4 months in prison.
Yeah, well, something else to consider is the barrier between felony and misdemeanor. A lot of defense attorneys, and I understand their logic, will not take a chance with that because convicted felon, your life's really over.
Yeah,
like that. Yeah. That's you can't do anything. Misdemeanor, you have a chance of pardon, expungement, depending on where you live. Like in Delaware for most crimes. But yeah, felony. I mean, you can also get a felony pardoned and expunged theoretically, but it's much harder, and you have to wait longer, and then you lose all your rights in between. And again, you might get it pardoned, which is different than a misdemeanor, which you have a decent shot of getting a pardon. So yeah, they might be thinking, okay, just to get into the world of non-felony.
Right.
But
it's like we're going to drop 4 Class A felony charges down to 1 Class C misdemeanor and, 4 months, and we'll even waive that just to... Why?
Yeah.
I mean, that's because the prosecutor knows they have nothing, and they want to get that conviction because every guilty plea is a conviction on their record, and they can keep it. 97% conviction rating in this country in the courts because plea agreements. I really disagree with the plea agreement system as it currently is in this country.
I feel like there almost needs to be a proportional guilt system where, a lot of stuff is factored in. It'd be complex. It'd be like the dimensional model for personality disorders compared to the categorical model. Instead of having borderline or not, let's look at the the 5-factor model adjusted for DSM and kind of look at each one and put a level. Like, okay, you might have done this, but you have mental health symptoms, right, or conditions. You have family stressors. You have money concerns. You're young. You're impulsive. Your personality. Let's, how guilty are you really? Instead of doing, guilty or not guilty. It's a simple system which, has been around for hundreds of years. That doesn't mean it's the best, and we have a lot of technology. We have a lot of more science behind mental health and personality and motivation and behavior. Maybe it's time to look at something that's graded.
Yeah. And how often in therapy do we tell clients, beware of black and white thinking?
Yeah.
It's like, beware of the binary choices. Not everything in life is a binary choice.
Be flexible.
Be flexible with your thinking. I mean, maybe we should be that way in society.
It makes sense. I mean, that's what we practice all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the difficulty is it would take a lot more experts in mental health getting involved in the world of crime. It would take a lot more resources. Like, plea deals are quick. And often defendants like them because they don't really think about the long-term criminal record. Or if they already have a criminal record, they think, doesn't matter. I just need to get out of jail. But some of the thinking, like, I've seen situations where I think, I'm not an attorney, but I would be in communication with an attorney, like somebody that I'm working with, and they're like, oh yeah, this guy or this gal didn't do it. And the client wants to plead guilty just to get out. Just because they're being held, they can't make bail. They can't make the $500 bail or $1,000 bail. So they'll plead guilty to whatever just to have the case over. Even though if they went to trial, or it wouldn't even get to trial because it would be dropped at an earlier stage, like pretrial motions would be gone. They can't afford the attorney for pretrial motions, and they're above the level for public defender. Or sometimes worse, they're not above the level and they have a public defender.
Yeah, that is arguably worse, to have a public defender.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of them, and they're great people, but they are overworked. Like,
absolutely,
you can't overstate that. Like, they're just they literally can't take another case, and they get another case.
I think the average time that a public defender has to see their client for the entirety of their case is 7 minutes. 7 minutes to sit with their client to go over the entire case.
To determine their fate.
To determine everything. Everything about this case. 7 minutes. I can't decide what to have for dinner in 7 minutes.
Sometimes I just stare off into space for 7 minutes, and I don't even know what I just did, let alone argue anything, talk about anything.
Probably dreaming about mullets.
That's definitely
very likely dreaming about mullets for sure.
Thinking about how quickly I can grow one, all of that.
How great they look. How they shouldn't have gone out of style.
Right, how poorly society made that decision that we don't like mullets anymore. I mean, who made that decision?
Just envisioning the sparkling, sparkles are coming off us.
The breeze just blowing the mullet in the wind. And,
was there ever a Simpsons episode where Homer had a mullet?
Yes, it was from Snake, the robber. Yeah.
Oh, right.
It was one of the Treehouse of Horrors episodes.
That's right.
Where he was frauding the electric chair and he got the hair transplant.
That's right.
But the hair was making him do evil things. He ended up ripping it off and shooting it. It was beautiful.
Any Simpsons where Homer has hair is a good Simpsons episode. Yeah. I mean, I don't mean the 3 strands. I mean, like...
Well, he's also got the M's in the back. Like,
that's right. That's right, yeah. He's got a lot there. All right, so any final thoughts on this case?
Jeff?
Well, like I said in the beginning, it seems to me that they primarily just looked at Jeff as a person, his behavior, his personality, just the way that he was, and made a lot of decisions based off of that. And especially based on the discussion that we just had, I'm sure that the investigators were happy to just have some kind of certainty. And so if they could find some kind of dots to connect and to determine in their mind and possibly have some other people around them be thinking the same way, well, now I figured this out, right? I'm going to give some peace to this other family members and to understand Jeff did it. He's the problem. We don't have to look anywhere else. There's no other problems here. This is what happened. And that's terrible. I mean, that's terrible. That's a terrible way of thinking about anything. I'm thinking if I had to make any kind of decision, and as counselors, we really pride ourselves on not trying to have an answer before somebody else is done, right? And that's what it seems like here, is that before anything was even done, really a true investigation or anything, they had an answer. And that's kind of like when somebody starts thinking about the response even before the other person's done talking, right? You should always just try to understand from somebody else's perspective, try to understand all the details about something. And those two seem pretty similar in my mind, that you should exhaust all options. And of course, presumption of innocence, until you have reasonable doubt. And so, yeah, really a lot of unfortunate things here. And but I'm glad, again, I'm glad that it was brought, that people are looking more into this case now, and that it's really brought to the forefront, and that people are reevaluating what possibly could have happened, instead of just seeing the news and think, oh, this kid killed his family, that's terrible, but really looking more into it critically. And so I'm glad that there are people who are bringing it more to the light and are working on it, even to a depth that lawyers, attorneys can't necessarily do, given time or just a lack of resources, perhaps, or whatever. But that people are so interested in the possible innocence of somebody that they would take the time to do what other people may not have the time or resources to do.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
So my big thoughts for the case was I went into researching, and when we first started talking about this case, I'd heard of it. I'd watched the 48 Hours, but it had been a while. And so I started by watching that episode over again. I watched the episode on investigative discovery, the Evil Within, which covered the case. And I was kind of like, okay, well, sounds like this guy did it. Right? And then the more I learned about the actual evidence, the way nothing was collected and how the investigation went, the more I went, well, that's really problematic investigation. And then the more I looked into the timeline, the more convinced I became that there's no way possible that he could have done that. And then there's much more reasonable explanations for it that tie to other things. So that's where I came down to, I'm 100% convinced. I really am. I think the investigation was so poor. They just laser focused on him from the beginning. We've seen that in other cases. As we mentioned many, many times in this episode, Michael Morton, you should check that out on the murder part. It's one of the other videos we did, if you haven't seen it yet. And the other thing I will end on with this one is at the very beginning of this particular video, when Jeff introduced himself, I forgot for a moment that his last name was Pincin, and I expected him to say Pelly. I've just been thinking about the Jeff Pelley case so much over the last little while. It was like, okay, is Jeff Pincin? Oh, right, Pincin. His last name's
Not
Pincin.
Pelly.
It's not Pelly. It's not Pelly. I kind of obsessed that enough with the case on that one. But that's what I've got.
We also don't even have the same initials, right? Because his first name's Robert, right? So I'm, less of an association there as well. So maybe I'm off the hook.
Still Jeff P.
Yeah, I know when I've worked on this case before, like the other video, I kept calling him Scott Pelley. I just couldn't stop. It just seemed so natural because that's a name that I'm very familiar with. A famous broadcaster. It's just hard to get into the frame of mind to say Jeff Pelley, but yeah, this case, I think, no matter what happens, I hope he gets out, because I don't think that he did it, but whatever happens, this is probably one of those cases that should be a reminder that critical thinking skills are so important. And, I don't know what the jury was thinking here. I don't know what the prosecutors were thinking, but it was not in line with any type of reason or logic that I'm aware of. It just makes no sense. I don't get it. And it worries me at another level that so many people are happy that he's in prison under these circumstances. They're like, oh, well, maybe he did it, so it's okay. That's not how our system works. And they wouldn't be happy if that was the justice that they were delivered. Like they were innocent and they were put in prison. Nobody would like that. Mm-hmm. So maybe a lack of empathy leads to people staying in prison when they shouldn't as well. And to speak to your point, Jeff, the attorneys and the investigators and the podcasters are unsung heroes in cases like this, because these people are forgotten. Like I said, for every Jeff Pelley, there's several thousand other people who are actually innocent, at least, who never get the attention of anybody on social media or, lawyers or anybody, investigators. They're just lost.
Jeff's involved with the innocence the Indiana University McKinney Wrongful Conviction Clinic. So, I mean, this is somebody who's a professor also utilizing the students to help with this, and so that it's gotten to the point where they don't. They have to utilize people who are invested in this for free, right? Students, presumably for free. I don't know if they're getting paid to do any of this, but that there's so much depth to this that they have to utilize a lot of outside resources that they may not have available otherwise, especially with public defenders and all that. So much to your point, unsung heroes, there's a lot of people that are working very hard to show that at the very least, he needs a new evidentiary trial.
Yeah, one of the theories of counseling is that all counselors should start off working with the most difficult cases, arguably major mood disorders with psychosis, schizophrenia, and then work to like the worried well, if you want that, private practice, or somebody's upset because of reasons that would be considered relatively mundane compared to something like psychosis or major depression. Maybe all law students should start off in a wrongful conviction association like that, like to see the downside and how things can go sideways with the law, and to keep that in mind, whether they become a prosecutor, a defense attorney, or a judge in the future, whatever they're going to do. It might be, it's the hardest cases in a way, right? Because you're fighting uphill
against other attorneys.
Yeah, who are positive they're right.
And investigators, and
and have the massive resources of the government pressing down on the individual. So maybe that would be the path for law students. I don't know much about how law students filter through the system, but I'm sure they have a curriculum just like any other profession.
I never got a chance to go to law school, so I don't know.
Yeah.
So it would have been land developer, then law?
Then lawyer?
Well, maybe, because, being a land developer would be useful to have some law knowledge.
Okay, yeah, there you go.
So,
okay.
Yeah. Criminal defense, probably relevant for a lot of land developers.
Arguably, yes. Especially in Florida.
All right, so we'll wrap up there. Really compelling case. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Jeff Pelley.
Not Scott Pelley.
Not Scott Pelley,
Not
although
Jeff
he's an interesting guy too, but Jeff Pelley. So again, a lot of lessons in this case we talked about. If you have any thoughts about it, please put those in the comments. We certainly appreciate it. See you again soon on the murder part. Thank you so much.